Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. This past summer, I had a remarkable dialogue with a journalist, Jonathan Kay, who defies all labels. And one of the things I really enjoy about him is that his background and his experience is all over the map. And of course, because it's an Origins podcast, we began with his origins, which are really quite interesting. He has a master's degree in engineering from McGill University in Canada, and then went and did a law degree at the Yale Law School. For a while, he was a tax lawyer before he slowly drifted into writing and journalism, and he was a founding editor on the editorial board of the National Post, and has written for many different magazines, and is now an editor and writer at Quillette, the online journal. He's also written books and also ghostwritten books and helped other people with the books. Among other things, he helped Justin Trudeau with his memoir, which is interesting since many people might want to classify Jonathan, because of his background, as a conservative writer. Well, that's what I say. He defies simple labels. And our conversation began around a story that he had recently broke, a huge investigative story, 15,000 words for Quillette that he'd written, about a claimed sex ring in the psychology department at McMaster University, which turned out to be ultimately a hoax, but not before many people's careers were impacted. And he investigated this in great detail, both its origins, its impact on the local community, how local newspapers ran with the story without necessarily knowing any details. And it's a very interesting example of how fake news, if you will, and salacious fake news can propagate throughout the media. And we discussed journalism far more generally, both the state of journalism in the world and his own stories that he's written on, not just the McMaster story, but stories on in the indigenous residential schools and the big scandals that were claimed about mass graves there. Also on stories related to, in fact, the James Webb Space Telescope, and claims about James Webb himself, and again, misstated claims about James Webb. It was a really fascinating discussion, as I say, about the state of journalism with a remarkably fascinating man, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. You can watch it ad-free on our Critical Mass Substack channel, which supports the nonprofit Origins Project Foundation, which produces this podcast. So I hope you'll consider subscribing to that Substack site, or you can watch it on our YouTube channel. I hope you'll consider subscribing to that, or listen to it on any podcast site. But however you listen to it or watch it, I think you'll find this discussion with Jonathan Kay remarkably interesting and insightful about the state of journalism, politics, and writing in the modern world. Enjoy. Well, Jonathan, thanks a lot for agreeing to be on the show. I've wanted to have you on for a while, and it's nice to be able to spend some time with you, at least virtually.
Yeah, appreciate the opportunity.
It's I've been I guess I first knew you by being a fan of your writing, and then got to know you a little bit as you've edited some of my writing, and in spite of that, I like you. I as you may know, this is an Origins podcast, and I want to talk to you about your writing and some of the key fascinating stories you've been working on, but I like to find out about people's origins and how they got to where they are at the beginning of each episode. And sometimes it takes a fair fraction of it because it's fascinating to me, and I hope to people who listen. But the first surprise to me was that you did your degrees in engineering, and I was shocked to see that. And let's go before we get there. Let's go further back. I know your mother, Barbara, from a writer. I learned your father was a financial person. I wondered. So, tell me about the upbringing. Was politics a frequent subject of discussion in the house?
Yeah, I think for a certain kind of late 20th century Jewish household, especially in a place like Montreal, it's just politics is kind of inescapable.
Yeah.
so you have the politics of language and Quebec separatism within the Anglo community in Quebec. I'm not going to belabor the parochial politics
Yeah.
of Quebec, but it's especially in the late 20th century, there was a lot of separatist agitation, and the Anglo community felt sometimes beleaguered by the French majority in Quebec, which itself felt beleaguered by the Anglo majority in Canada as a whole. Again, Canadian politics are so fascinating to international listeners that I'm sure they want me to go on for hours, but I will resist that
Well,
temptation.
it's interesting. You're 15 years younger than me or so, and so I experienced that in a direct way. I remember the War Measures Act, which I'm not,
Yeah,
which I
Trudeau,
yeah, and
Pierre Trudeau, I should
yeah, the
I
other
should
Trudeau,
say.
yeah, the other Trudeau,
Yeah,
we should say,
yeah,
and
yeah. That was the FLQ. That was a legitimate, though minor by international standards, a terrorist campaign
yeah,
in Quebec.
they
Yeah,
killed a well-known
cabinet minister. Yeah,
minister, Pierre Laporte,
yep.
and I remember it because my brother was actually he's now a Southern American Republican, but he was a separatist in Quebec and taught at the Université de Sherbrooke Law School,
Wow,
and
wow.
I only spoke French to him for 10 years. I only spoke he had completely assimilated, and so it was an interesting time. I think he was a student then in Ottawa, and he got arrested briefly during that time, during the
If you didn't get arrested at least once as a student in those
yeah.
days, I mean, although that's interesting. It's like 6 degrees of Lawrence Krauss. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, but on top of the, again, parochial Canadian Quebecois politics, you also had a lot of the questions about Zionism in the Middle East that Jewish communities, maybe less so now, but
Mm.
certainly during that period, Montreal had an unusually high concentration of Holocaust survivors among
Oh,
its sizable Jewish community at the time. My mother
oh,
was involved in the Sadie Bronfman Center, which uh, at the time, and I think still, had a very prominent role in the cultural life of Jews. Our household was never especially religious. I myself call myself a lapsed Jew because I'm not observant. But
that's most Jews. I think
yeah,
you're part of the
mm,
majority.
I'm part of the majority. But certainly Jewish in a cultural and political sense. So there was just a lot of talk. Again, I think most people who grow up in this kind of household will know that uh, certain kinds of political questions about identity, about belonging, about bigotry, anti-Semitism, certainly Zionism, you know, foreign policy, all of this was kind of part of the oxygen of daily family conversations. Uh, so yeah, politics was a big part of it, but also, maybe closer to home for you, science was also a big part of my
I
upbringing.
was
So
going to ask about that.
my dad was he was an only child who grew up in a Russian exile community in China. So
Oh, wow,
yeah, northeastern China,
wow.
mid 20th century, had a sizable white Russian and also sizably Jewish population, largely composed of emigres, um, who actually helped the Chinese build out the railroad.
Oh,
In the
that's the reverse of Canada.
A little bit, yeah. And that's when my dad grew up, came to Canada as part of those whole complex series of population movements after World War II. He and his mother and father ended up in Canada. None of them spoke much English, including my father. Got
Wow.
deposited in a Montreal school, I think around the age of 10, speaking barely any English. He's a Russian speaker.
Wow.
Uh, and and eventually he became an engineer. And then,
Oh,
yeah, so he was a metallurgical engineer.
wow.
Uh, and then he went to McGill University. I ended up not having any idea what to do with my life. I ended up as a metallurgical engineer. I did a master's degree. So my master's work focused on thermodynamics and fluid flow. And so
Wow.
I wrote computer simulations of heat transfer and fluid flow in pyrometallurgical processes. So like blast furnaces and all that stuff basically extracting metal from ore. That was kind of what I did. And then I realized that I liked writing computer simulations, but I wasn't particularly skilled at working in a industrial environment where I had to align theory with industrial reality. And I ended up at law school, uh, practiced as a tax lawyer for a couple of years in New York City, uh, realized I didn't like that very much. At the age of 30, kind of began real life as a journalist, and that was 25 years ago.
Well, this I want to unpack this because I do find it fascinating. I didn't, and now I even find it more fascinating because in some ways you followed both your parents' careers then.
Yep.
Okay, I mean,
Yep.
hadn't realized your father was an engineer in the same field as you, and then of course your mother's a journalist, so you really did move in both areas. But so I wanted to ask, this then leads me to maybe understand a little bit more about why you went to engineering. Did you go in because when you were younger, did either of your parents have more of an influence on you, or did you talk science to your dad, or did you read books about science, or was that ever um, uh, um,
So yeah, so I think as a teenager, for younger listeners, it's hard to communicate how oblivious teenagers of my generation were to the whole idea of like the future. And I gave lots of thought to like what kind of car I wanted to drive, and you know, the Montreal Expos starting rotation. And if you ask me, well, what do when I was 16 or 17, what do you want to be when you grow up? I kind of just assumed I'd make a living, but I didn't really know how. And
yeah,
this is in distinction. I see my own kids who are that age. Kids today are just much more focused on that. They realize they have
on
to get started.
on a
It's
career? Yeah, we didn't think
yeah,
it, but I think it was even more so when I was younger. No one ever. When I went
yeah.
to school in the university in the early '70s, mid '70s, no one cared about a
And
career.
part of this is, I'll say part of it is privilege because I grew up um, in a Montreal Jewish community where every single person I knew went to college.
Ah.
It wasn't a question of whether you go to college. It was which college, how many degrees are you going to get. Um, I mean, I was sort of dimly aware in my bubble of privilege that there were people who didn't go to university, but we didn't even, it wasn't even something you talked about in my household or the household of my
W-
relatives. Just
was that
everyone went to.
was that because you to some extent, was it because it was a Jewish household too? I mean, my parents, unlike your parents, neither of my parents went to finished high school, but it wasn't even ever considered that my brother and I wouldn't go to university. That was where
Yep.
he was going to be a doctor. I was going to be. I mean, he was going to be a
Right.
lawyer. I was going to be a doctor. He became a lawyer, as it turned out, and may have been at Yale Law School around the same time as you, although he's a lot older. But he went back to anyway. I want to ask about that.
So yeah,
Um,
so I graduated Yale Law in '97, although I wasn't a particularly gifted law student. But I will say that part of this is because it may be, I don't want to say generational because between you and me, I think it's a fraction of a generation. But
yeah.
my mother, my mother was born in Canada, and her own father came over from Poland when he was young, and I think her mom was actually might have been born in Canada. I'm not sure, but uh, so on her side, there was already a full generation of people who'd gone to university.
Hmm.
And in that kind of immigrant culture, one generation makes a huge difference because my mother's father, literally as a child, sold rags on the streets of Toronto out of a pushcart.
Schmata.
Yeah, shmata. I mean, it was like the lowest rung of the
Yeah,
shmata
yeah,
business.
yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, he was just part of this, like, if adventures of Augie March, like if you sort of those immigrants, not necessarily Jewish stories, but immigrant stories, like starting from the very bottom in
Yeah.
large American, or in this case Canadian cities, people will recognize him as a character. He was successful, worked hard, um, and then had children who could take for granted some of the trappings
Yeah.
uh, of socioeconomic privilege in North America. And so, as I said, I just took it for granted I'd go to university. And this was still an age where if you went to university, you kind of just assumed you'd stumble into a good job. And now
Hmm.
that's not the case, right? Like,
Yeah.
unless you're careful, you could get good marks in university and end up in working at McDonald's. Not that there's anything wrong with working at McDonald's. I've worked at
Yeah, but
McDonald's, but it's not something you maybe aspire to after investing 3 or 4 years of education. And so again, I didn't think about it, but I had the habits of mind of an engineer because my dad was always very gifted. Well, by the way, both my parents are still around and uh, probably will listen to this, so I don't want to speak about them in the past tense. Um, but he had the habits of mind and speech of an engineer. So like when talking to me as a kid, he'd say things like, "Hey, you ever wonder why ice floats?" I said, "No, why does ice float?" And he'd say,
oh,
"Well, let's talk about density. And then let's talk about what would happen if, like most solids, ice were more dense than its liquid form. Life wouldn't exist on the planet because the
exactly.
whole underside of lakes and ponds would just be, a frozen tablet, and you'd get no life develop." So even as
Yeah.
a kid, he
Wow.
again, this wasn't engineering, but it was just looking at the world through an analytical
How
lens.
lucky. Yeah. How
I was
lucky.
very lucky, yeah. And
Yeah.
my mother I don't think has any particular interest or gift with math or science, but just gave me a completely, like, she'd give me books to read, and she'd um, introduce me to writers that I came to love, and some that I came not to love. Like she introduced me to George Orwell at a young age, which I did love,
Yeah. Sure. How could you not?
um, and then she's always been passionate about mystery novels, so that's something that I didn't much care for, but
Ah.
uh, there were always just plenty of books in our house, and
I was going to ask
so
about books.
yeah,
Parents and books are two things, and that are important. So your mother sort of was the encouraging for books. Your father was the encouraged you to think, analytically about the world. And by the way, I meant to tell you, my physics teacher jokingly said that the fact that water is one of the few substances that expands when it freezes was proof of God. Um, but he meant it as a joke.
yeah.
Um,
It's I mean, it's one of these little things that is the key to life, right?
Yeah, yeah. Life wouldn't
Yeah,
exist on Earth if
yeah,
rivers and oceans froze from the bottom up.
yeah.
Um, but so parents, no, but your father eventually, like many engineers, in fact, like I think like the majority of engineers, frankly, left and went and either became management or finance. Is that the case? Was
Yeah,
he?
so he was a metallurgical engineer, and in Canada at the time, still uh, had a large mining, and as a result of mining, a large ore processing industry. And so he he eventually made a living doing things like going off to mines or geological discoveries. People were deciding whether it would become a mine, and he had the expertise to evaluate whether it was a good investment based on things like, what's the concentration of precious metal
Yeah.
within, the ore samples, and how accessible is it, and that's how he made a living. And then eventually he became um, you know open to other investment opportunities, and he got into biotech.
Oh,
um, but
smart.
yeah, as you say, there's a lot of engineers who are able to translate their knowledge of some core element of, like, design engineering or process engineering into um, expertise in a particular business area, and in turn, over the course of your career, they can do all sorts of things.
Yeah, but that wasn't what you decided. That wasn't the direction you decided you want to go in. But before we get to law school, it still amazes me because it is a jump. I'm often wondered what, I guess, how much of a jump it would have been for me to consider law school when I graduated. But before then, we talked about, both your parents and books and science. But the one thing I did want to ask was about school. School, was that an encouragement to you? And did you like science in school, or were teachers particularly useful in terms of encouraging you to read or write, or was it, I found it's amazed but to find that people have mixed. Some of them, really good teachers were instrumental in their life, and for others, they found school got in the way. So always interested to find out what in your case. And
So I think there's a certain type. I think, like, maybe Bill Gates is the paradigmatic example, where he's just this guy who had a kind of monomania for computers,
yeah,
And he was never going to have a teacher who was going to match his own enthusiasm level or native skill in that area. So, I mean, I think in Bill Gates' example, I don't think he even got a college degree. He was just in
Wait,
such a,
he did drop out of. Oh, yeah.
yeah. And then I think well below that level of intellect and success, there's somebody like me who had gifts, but he definitely needed teachers to encourage them. And again, part of my privilege, I went to a good school. It was called Selwyn House. It was like a, little Victorian suit and tie boys' school in Montreal.
Oh,
It was sort of like a lot of, call it, I guess, immigrant communities. Like the Anglo community in Montreal was more Anglo than the source community in UK.
yeah,
Sometimes these communities get frozen in time. So if you looked at the old stock WASP Anglo community in Westmount, which is
yeah,
where a lot of it became like, something that looked not quite like 19th century UK, but like we had these schools where we wear suit and tie and we sang God Save the Queen when I was in very early grades, and we said grace before meals and stuff. Uh, and it also happened to be a very good school with outstanding English teachers and science teachers and math teachers. I was able to learn calculus in grade 11. And so by the time I got to university, calculus wasn't an issue for
yeah,
me. Statistics, linear algebra, I was able to breeze through all that stuff in part because I had teachers who taught it well and encouraged it. And it made math fun for me. And if math is fun, then engineering
yeah.
is, I wouldn't say it's a breeze. There were courses that were challenging for me. Boundary value problems is something that to this day is gives me nightmares. And I know electrical engineers who still work with boundary value problems. If you've never had to do BVP, I don't recommend it.
What about physics, though? Why I always wonder why people. Is it because of a job? I mean, or maybe I mean, because to me, well, when I was chair of a department, we actually created an engineering physics degree to encourage, engineers who are interested in science to be able to get a degree, a degree that would allow, give them a credential and also allow them to, focus a little more on some of the science.
Yeah. I mean, I have a mixed relationship with physics because physics is almost too broad a term for it's. I mean, physics is about understanding the universe. And so I tell people, says, "Oh, I don't like physics, I like chemistry." And I say, "Well, chemistry is physics. It's the physics of atoms and it's the
Yeah,
physics of electrons. And,
I agree.
if you're studying electron orbitals, guess what? You're studying physics."
Yeah.
Um,
I used to like to teach all of chemistry in one lesson when I taught quantum mechanics. I'd say, now we're going to do all of chemistry.
yeah, I mean, if you understand orbitals, then
Yeah.
you're. And by the way, I'm sure there are people in chemistry and in physics who it is kind of blurry whether they're chemists or whether
Yeah,
they're
sure there
physicists
are
because
physical chemists. Yeah, absolutely.
um, I mean, my most of my latter exposure to physics came in terms of analyzing things like the transition between laminar and turbulent flow in fluids. uh, the kind of engineering I was in, there was a lot of like analysis of like, well, how much pressure is required um, to push a certain kind of like non-Newtonian fluid down 100 meters of pipe at a facility. And ultimately, at the end of the day, 99% of the time, these things get reduced to rule of thumb formulas that sit in engineering trade books,
Yeah,
which was always kind of unsatisfying for me because as a grad student, you're always like, well, forget the formula. Let's figure this out from first principles or
that's the
design.
that would you sounding like a physicist more than an engineer there.
Well, yeah, except I never had the brain power to actually like do it from first principles. So at the end of the day, I was like everybody else. I relied on these rule of thumb, sort of call them cheat codes. And um, I did really enjoy though the theory of especially I had heat transfer. That was, I guess, I had a fantastic um, thesis supervisor. His name is Frank Mucciardi. He subsequently took on a leadership role in engineering as a whole at McGill. And to me, the greatest quality you should look for in a thesis advisor is somebody who has an emotional connection with the subject matter. So in the case of
Sounds
Frank
good.
Mucciardi, so again, it's probably more detailed than you want about my master's work, but
No, sure.
I designed this experimental apparatus to, we were dealing with something called the heat pipe, which is it's a phase transformation based way of they actually use it, I think, in some astrophysical applications. You have an intervening medium. In this case, it was sodium, and you're evaporating the working substance, in this case sodium, at one end of the heat pipe, and the gas flows to the other end, which is the heat sink, and then it turns into a liquid and ejects the heat associated with phase transformation, and then it goes back to the heat source. And so this has lots of applications in pyrometallurgy. And so anyway, so I built this contraption out of Pyrex, and instead of sodium, we used I think it was called naphthalene. It's basically, I think, sodium hexafluoride, if I remember correctly. It's the stuff you make mothballs out of.
Mm-hmm.
And I set the apparatus up, and we had it going, and it worked great. Like, it's just if anyone wants to, they can read my master's thesis. It's at McGill University. But what I remember was I set up the apparatus, I took my measurements, I made sure it worked, and then I went home. And then like an hour later, I realized I forgot something I needed at school, and I came back, and I saw Frank Mucciardi, my thesis supervisor, still looking at it, like still watching it run, like it was the greatest television program he'd ever seen. Like he was binge watching it. This is the days before Netflix.
Yeah.
I said, Frank, like, what the hell are you doing? Like, it's like 8 p.m. or something. He says, yeah, I know, but it's just so mesmerizing, isn't it? And I thought, oh my God, what a nerd. But then I also thought, like, this is the quality you want in a thesis supervisor. And it also convinced me this is why I'm never going to become a professor, because I don't think it's a sufficient condition to be a successful academic. I do think it's a necessary condition to become an academic. And so that moment, I think, taught me, like, this is the kind of relationship you have to have with science, and then that particular aspect of science, to really spend the next 30 or 40 years of your life publishing papers and supervising other people and setting up experiments and recording data and all the frustrations that go with it.
Sure.
Because not every experiment's going to be successful. And if I may tax your patience on this was the same thing that convinced me to get out of law, because I was a tax lawyer. This is several years later. I was a tax lawyer on Park Avenue, catering to these very wealthy clients who, wanted to escape taxation on the, when they'd sell assets and stuff. And my boss, his name was Nat Boydman. He worked out of Montreal. He was this legendary tax lawyer. Like, he would spend his weekend reading about this stuff. And I remember once I called his office on a Saturday just to leave a message. And he answered the phone. I said, Nat, what are you doing at the office on Saturday? He says, oh, I was just reading this new paper on international taxation, and I just lost track of time, And I was like, no, I don't know. I think that's like, that's absolutely foreign to me. But then I realized, like, it was the same thing as Frank Mucciardi looking at the tabletop experiment. Like, this was his Netflix. And if that's your Netflix, that's a great way to make your career.
Yeah, I mean, look, I love those stories because, I think it's true. And I think you've elaborated that it's true in every field, but I can certainly attest. I've often tell people that scientists, don't do science because they want to save the world, or, they do it because it gives them great pleasure.
Yeah.
And they couldn't possibly do it well if it didn't, because you can't spend, as you point out, 20 years on stuff, a lot of which is frustrating or fails, if in some way it didn't give you some kind of positive personal and emotional feedback. And I think it's true if you want to excel in any profession, and you've indicated it. But
journalism.
Let me ask you, then I am intrigued, because so you graduated in engineering. You never worked in engineering. You decided right away you wanted to go to law school, and why? What was it about law school? Was it a job? Was it a matter of sort of a career that might have a job afterwards, or was it something else?
No, so the law school thing, by this time, I guess I was already in my early 20s, and I retained the same completely ignorant, childlike uh, naivete about professional life. And I just kind of assumed that if I picked the right field, professional life would be sort of very similar to what I was studying. And I had this very good friend who I went to high school with. He uh, also from Montreal, and his name was Chris Naughty, and we would study at the library together in McGill, and he was studying for the LSAT, the law school admission test,
Yeah.
and I remember he was showing me what he was doing, and it was like, you'd read something and you have to answer questions,
Yeah.
and my favorite, like these, I think it was called logical reasoning. It was like Sally is having a dinner party and A can't sit next to B and C has to be across from D and E and F can't be like, I was like, oh, wow, cool. I love doing stuff like this. Like, I guess this is what being a lawyer is like. So I'll become a lawyer. And, and then and by the way, part of law school is kind of like that, not with dinner parties, but, with sort of the arguments you make
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
yeah, like it's not, maybe it's maybe 20% like that. And that was the part I was good at. And then as with engineering, the part where it was more real life application of theory wasn't really my strong suit. I was a tax lawyer, and tax
Why
law is
tax
probably,
law? I mean, I hate to say it, but that sounds to me like the most boring possible part of
well,
law.
that's a stereotype.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I like tax law because it was kind of as
Logical.
close to the academic aspect
Yeah.
as you'd get in any kind of branch of law. Like if you're doing, I don't know, things like labor law or litigation, there's a lot of like kind of strategizing and, client management. But tax law is like there are certain when you're structuring transactions, it's not that different from structuring a dinner party in an LSAT question. Like
Yeah, no, I
there,
can see it now that you mention it.
yeah.
It's sort of a,
Now, the problem is if you're interested in changing the world, it's not like I'm, you know, Nelson Mandela or anything like that,
yeah.
but you're kind of making rich people richer. So your typical client, I was working for a firm called Goodman Phillips Weinberg, which doesn't exist anymore. It was a Canadian firm. This was their New York City office, and most of our clients were very wealthy Toronto or Montreal based companies or individuals or families that were trying to like, buy and sell US based assets and not
Yeah.
pay a lot of tax. And surprise, surprise, a lot of these people had a lot of money to begin with. And
Yeah.
my job was to make sure they still had a lot of money at the end of the transaction, which again, like was kind of fun from a logic games point of view,
Yeah.
but it didn't feel like the most important work in the universe.
Yeah.
Um, and again, you don't have to be a social justice warrior
Yeah.
to maybe think, uh, there's nothing wrong with that work. I don't.
Yeah.
It's not like when I quit, I was like wrote social justice graffiti on the side of the
Yeah.
building, explaining why I didn't nail any theses to the door
Yeah.
of the law firm. But it wasn't for me, and I was just more drawn to the fact, in journalism, I could write about 100 different things.
Yeah. Sure.
Tax law, like the thing is, if you're a writer, you like writing about anything. So the part of being a tax lawyer that I liked is when my boss would say, "Hey, I want you to write a memorandum about this new change that has been made to the estate tax law." And even though I was writing about something like just really most people would find incredibly boring, and at the end of the day, maybe I found boring, the act of putting words on the page to explain this stuff, I really enjoy. And
Mm-hmm.
that's for those who are foolish enough to ask me for career advice, the number one advice, it's not just me who offers this, is what is the aspect of your current job, if any, that you enjoy? And how can you extrapolate that to full-time employment in the so being a lawyer, the 20 or 30% of the job that involved writing, even on extremely technical subjects, I liked. And I was like, okay, well, how can I do this all the time, but about like every week tackle two or three different subjects. So I'm not just writing about law. And that's kind of how I stumbled into journalism.
So okay. So hold that thought because I think that's interesting. You sort of, I know a lot of people who, and interesting enough, sort of late, not late in life, but at a mid-career or early career level, suddenly realize, hey, I want to do something else. And interestingly enough, it's not something that different than one of my parents do. One of the most famous examples I know is one of the smartest physicists in the world, if not the smartest, a guy named Ed Witten, who sort of developed string theory. He was doing politics. He actually wrote speeches for McCarthy. If Eugene, if he had won, then Ed Witten might have become a White House aide. But then lost, and then Ed suddenly realized, oh, my father's a physicist. Maybe I should do that. And within about a year, he'd mastered
It's
all of physics.
fallback. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Fallback.
he,
Yeah.
and but anyway, what this is solipsistic, or at least it's personal. But when did you enter Yale Law School? I'm just interested.
94.
Oh, okay.
And
You
and then
just
I graduated 97.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
most famous person in my law school class, because I don't anticipate you're going to ask that question, but people always ask me that, like,
Yeah.
who was the Bill Clinton of your law school
Yeah.
class? I was Cory Booker,
Okay. Yeah.
who went on to make a huge name for himself,
Yeah.
for mayor of Newark, and of course, he's a senator, Democratic senator, and he was a couple of months ago. I was at my 25th law school reunion. He was there. Uh, Always a charmer. We knew him. We knew he'd go far because I think he played tight end at Stanford, and he was just like tall, good looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if he's mixed race or black, but just like the most charming, just lights up a room,
Mhm.
brilliant. And I think he had, like, one of his relatives were Jewish, or like we'd do Passover Seders, and he'd come, and within 5 minutes, I think he was like leading the service. Like, even it was just, you just knew this guy was going places. And whatever you think of his politics, I I don't think there's a person in my class who he didn't charm. I mean, he's just a really smart guy.
Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
that's a key part of being a politician. No, I only ask because I taught at Yale, as you may or may not know, for almost 10 years, and
I didn't
but
know. I did not know that.
I was teaching the physics department, and I left because I didn't want my daughter to go to high school or middle school to high school in New Haven. But uh,
Well,
uh,
that's interesting because New Haven is the classic town and gown, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
it's just it's exactly the minute you go outside the university, as one of my graduate students used to say, it had all the disadvantages of a big city without any of the benefits. But anyway, um, so I left in 93, so we almost overlapped.
If I can just say, New Haven is a fascinating place because I lived in the Taft Building,
Uh-huh.
southeast corner of College and Chapel,
Yeah.
named after President Taft, who, by the way,
Yeah.
was also a Supreme Court justice and a legislator. I think he's the only president who wore the Triple Crown.
Yeah.
And in the lobby of our building was a bar. It was just the weirdest place because, like, it was just known that Yale students didn't go to that bar.
Yeah.
It was like there were Yale students living all over, but that was a townie bar, and there was a place across the street where that was a townie bar. That's where we go. And coming from Canada, where we don't have this as much, this sort of like checkerboard ghettos and stuff like
Yeah.
that, is the whole experience of living in New Haven was such a mind blowing
Hmm.
education in the realities and like the hypocrisies of American rhetoric about class and race, and it's one big melting pot. And even at Yale, where I was surrounded by all these very well-meaning, highly progressive, as the term we didn't use then, but we now use it, very progressive liberal people, but they all lived in the same little enclaves
Yeah,
out
of
in
course. Yeah,
Milford,
no,
and yeah,
you
yeah,
play. I There are parts of Yale like that. Well, went once the medical school. You just wouldn't go that part of New Haven,
yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah.
and the building you were in. I think I remember that. I mean, it was sort of depressing to me. It was sort of the only mall downtown, and all the. I think I remember when the Macy's closed down. I think it
Oh
just
no,
sort of
that
felt
mall
like
was a
it was.
disaster. Yeah, it was a
Yeah,
disaster, that mall.
and you go down there, and it was like 5 blocks from my office, and it was like a different world, and it was depressing. But I understand let's go back to the discovery that you like to write, which is interesting. And did it occur? And by the way, again, since I always seem to it return to me at one some or another, I like to write, but I was really fortunate in the sense that my scientific career allowed me to be. I mean, I had to sacrifice every now and then, but allowed me to do my science that I really enjoyed, and then switch back and forth to writing, and it. So I hadn't planned it that way, but it turned out to be. Was nice about that is that you could balance uh, and back and forth as long as you stayed up most nights all night. But uh, So being able
Well, I
to
was saying,
write.
I mean, if you're successful enough at academia, you can start writing your own ticket and say, well,
Exactly. If you're,
yeah.
I was lucky enough to be successful enough in science to be able to write, and that was
And
just,
for some people, that means that's university administration. For other
yeah. And
people, it's
I almost got
advocacy.
suckered into that. And I'm so
Oh
glad I
boy,
didn't.
big mistake. A big
The dark
mistake. Yeah.
side. I
Yeah.
was just saying to someone else the other day that I've really never met an academic who's gone into administration who hasn't gone to the dark side, who hasn't been subsumed, and I've only know actually I know one or two, and I've known a lot of deans and presidents, and they all become Darth Vader. But anyway, we'll talk about
Yeah.
universities in a
Sure.
bit, because it saddens me what is
Yep.
happening. And okay, so did it occur to you when you decided you want to be a journalist, when you realized that writing was what you really liked, that your mother was a journalist, and hey, I did you talk to her about that transition?
So, my mother had always like dabbled in writing things like book reviews,
Yeah,
for things like the Montreal Gazette, and other publications. She didn't become a columnist at the National Post, which is the Canadian newspaper where I
yeah.
started my journalistic career, until 4 years after I had been at the National Post.
Ah,
So, much in the way there's like these families, like for instance, Barbara Frum was
yeah.
a famous
David
CBC
Frum.
broadcaster, and then
Okay.
of course David Frum and Linda Frum became writers and journalists. And I think sometimes I'm certainly absolutely not as famous as any of the Frums, but I think sometimes people see that my mother is a successful columnist and that I've been doing journalism for 25 years, and they assume it was kind of a similar pattern. It's actually not. I became a full-time journalist in 98. My mother only became a weekly columnist, a regular columnist in 2002, 4 years later.
4 years later.
And so in a way, it was kind of the opposite because she saw that I was having a great time at the National Post. I made some introductions, and I think she is she is certainly a more gifted natural columnist than I am because she has very strong opinions.
She certainly does.
Uh, I was I love doing journalism. I love writing essays. I love being an editor and a podcaster. But every week saying this is where the truth lies on issue X in 750 words, there's a certain personality and talent that goes with that. I never had that, and
Interesting.
I was I was a columnist for maybe a decade,
Yeah, I
but
know you.
my columns always veered more into like book reviews or essays. Not that I didn't have my opinions, but she very quickly developed a very strong following for her columns
Sure.
and still
Yeah.
does. It's been,
You had a voice that was clear,
yeah, and left or right. This sort of goes left or right.
Yeah,
And she has that, and so because she gained and rightly gained so much fame in Canada for her columns, I think people said, "Oh, then along came John,
yeah.
riding her coattails," and I agree to that with that to the extent that I think she's more well known, deservedly so. But chronologically, I actually got into the profession before she did.
Interesting. Now,
Yeah,
let's go. I hate to have sounding like I'm grilling you, but and I am, I guess.
it's your podcast. Yeah, you
Yeah,
deserve
I
to be. I
know,
mean,
but but I found it. We'll get to other. The great thing about having a podcast that lasts a while is that we can go into depth in
yeah,
a variety of
sure.
areas. Um, that the National Post. So you started your career at the National Post, which was just starting. Why the National Post?
Oh, well, because they hired me.
No, no, but I mean, was that the reason? I mean, but look, I have to say, and I don't think I've ever said this publicly. I mean, I had already left Canada a long time before the National Post began, and from a distance, when I saw it, I thought, oh, this conservative thing, and now, of course, I have been writing the National Post among other things, and I'm just wondering, um, did the other national newspaper, which is the one I knew when I left, was the Globe and Mail, the only national newspaper in Canada at the time when I left, when I
yeah.
lived there. Um, was it had nothing to do with politics, or it was just a matter of an available job, or what?
So, uh, I had been writing as a hobby, I guess, for the previous year or two. So after law school, I became a lawyer, and evenings and weekends, I'd sort of write these freelance articles about everything under the sun, and I'd send them to a bunch of places. And
Hmm.
one of the places I sent them to was this magazine, which is now defunct, called Saturday Night, which was
Uh-huh.
run out of Toronto. The editor was a guy named Ken White,
Yeah.
who's now a successful book publisher, Ken White then became, in 1998, the founding editor-in-chief of the newspaper, the National Post, which Conrad Black had started. And it was just part of the good luck that has gone with me my whole professional life, which is like, this is the last broadsheet newspaper created in Canada.
Yeah.
Because it was like the brief interregnum, when there was like maybe a sort of a conservative journalistic flourishing in Canada. They wanted an alternative to the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. And it was still seen as possible as like, hey, maybe we can make money from broadsheet newspapers. And there was that little window of opportunity. They created the National Post. I got hired because Ken White knew of me through my freelance work. And that's how I started my career. So when, I was kind of flippant. I said, why did I go to the National Post? Because they hired me. This was also the period in Canadian arts and letters, which maybe it still exists, is that there was such an inferiority complex of Canada vis-a-vis the United States that the fact that I had an Ivy League degree in Canada meant that, like, it's like, oh, he has no journalistic experience. He's kind of a nerd, and he doesn't interview well, but he went to Yale, so like maybe we should hire. And that's kind of how I got the job. I mean, that and the fact that I think, I wrote some fairly well-received articles on a freelance basis, but in today's climate, I never would have got hired, because when I started hiring people based on proof of concept of like, well, do you have a blog that people read? Do you have social media feeds? Like, show me stuff you've written and on a ongoing basis that shows that you can come into work Monday to Friday and produce journalism that people want to read. Part of it was 1998, blogging and social media wasn't so much a thing, but so people just got hired on the basis of like, well, this seems like a smart person who's written 5 or 6 articles for, like the Canadian Journal of stuff no one really particularly likes to read. And no one gets hired on that basis anymore. So I was like one of the last cohort of journalists who got hired kind of just on the basis of my resume, which didn't even have that much to do with journalism.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I know that, having obviously gotten my degrees in the United States and worked in the United States, to see that use that Canadian preference. There was that guy who tried to, I forget his name now, I should know him, an academic who thought he could become prime minister, but he was
Michael Ignatieff.
Yeah, Michael Ignatieff.
Yeah. I mean, Harvard. And it turns out the Liberal Party was very impressed with his Harvard resume, but voters not so much. I met Michael Ignatieff a couple of years ago on Yonge Street in a Canadian Tire store. He's the nicest guy in the world. I mean, all these politicians, when you meet them,
they have to be.
Stephen Harper is a little cranky, but Michael Ignatieff, it's after all the sort of slings and arrows of politics, you kind of like start to half believe a lot of the accusations made against, Ignatieff is just this academic snob who, just sort of like swanned into Canada from Harvard and wanted to be coronated. Yeah. But 90% of this is political propaganda. At the end of the day, it felt kind of bad for Ignatieff. He drank the Kool-Aid that all these liberals had poured into his glass. Yeah. And at the end of the day, he was just a very smart guy who's written some very good books, who wasn't a particularly good politician.
Yeah, well, he discovered that, but he's done okay since then, so it's okay. There's one thing I found when reading about you that did surprise me. Given to some extent, given the writing and given the direction of the place you write for most now, was that you were involved in helping Justin Trudeau with his memoir?
Yeah.
So you want to go over that and tell me your opinion of Justin Trudeau?
So this was 2014, I guess, and Trudeau was on the cusp of, well, as we now know, we didn't know at the time, but as we now know, he was about to become a multi-term prime minister. And his people came to me, or came to my agent, and said, like, we need a writer who can like stress test a lot of the stuff that we want to put in the book, which is to say, they weren't looking for somebody who would just act as a kind of scribe for every aphorism or sunny promise that that came out of Justin's mouth. They wanted somebody who could push back and say, well, what does that mean exactly? Or, well, we could put that in the book, but I can tell you the conservatives are going to jump over all that because, you've used the phrase root causes, or if you, like, I knew where the minefields were when it came to language. And I also had worked on several other successful books. Like part of my professional life is I'm a ghostwriter and I help people. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not the first or the last book I've ghostwritten.
Interesting.
And I gotta say, Justin is incredibly charming and also a very smart guy. So I think politics makes people dumber.
Yeah.
And Justin, if you got to know him, he's a great athlete. He's very charming. He's very widely read. So this is something I think we included in the book, is that Pierre Trudeau, Justin's dad, was a very stereotypical sort of intellectual father who was always like giving his kids things like,
I was going to say, it'd be hard for me to imagine being Pierre Trudeau's son,
but
and
like
not
to a
being
fault.
exposed.
Like he would, they had one TV in the house and it was in the basement, and like I think they were allowed to watch like an hour of TV a week. It was, and then the kids would ask a question about geography, and just Pierre would say, well, here's a book about by Herodotus, why don't you read about his travels in Asia Minor, or like it was kind of a little over the top. But what I was impressed with Trudeau is that he actually wore his reading quite lightly. So I mean, I think he did read writers like Herodotus, like on his father's urging. But if you went to his study where we conducted some of the interviews, he was a huge fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Well, that shows great taste.
Well, it does, but it also shows like he wasn't ashamed of his adolescent reading preoccupations. Like every 15-year-old boy read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and thought it was high literature, including me.
Well, I still think it's high literature. So there you go.
So, but he wasn't embarrassed about talking about that, or Star Wars, or Game of Thrones.
That's great.
Song of Ice and Fire, as I should say.
So he was an intellectual snob, and which Pierre Trudeau was. There's zero doubt.
He was, but in an age when you could get away with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. When it was when it helped him tremendously, and his effete sense. I mean, I grew up in that era. I'm older than you, and Pierre Trudeau was prime minister during much of the time I was in my adolescence and later. In fact, for what it's worth, I used to work next door to the prime minister's place when I was in college, and I used to see Justin in the lawn, because in the old days you could just go up to the house and knock on the door, which we used to do all the time, and ask for Margaret. Wow. But yeah, so it's weird for me to see him as prime minister now, because the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics used to be right next to the prime minister's house, and I had a summer job there.
I never worked at the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics, but I did work at the McDonald's at the corner, southwest corner of Atwater and St. Catherine, where on at least one occasion Pierre and Justin came in for a hamburger that I cooked.
Oh, there you go.
I was 16 years old.
66 degrees of separation again.
This was 1984. I was making $3.54 an hour as a fry cook at that McDonald's, which was kitty corner from the Montreal Forum, where the Canadians then played, but no longer. And once in a blue moon, Pierre Trudeau would come in, and it was on this occasion that he came in with Justin. And yeah, I was one of the fry cooks that day. So again, not Hertzberg Institute of Physics, but still an important Montreal institution.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe more. So yeah, no. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think the Hertzberg Institute moved out west to Vancouver Island afterwards. Okay. But it was So yeah, more than a decade apart. But it's good to hear that about Trudeau. Now, so you think the image of Pierre Trudeau as kind of this jock, lucky gene kind of goofy guy, or at least non-intellectual, is completely invented by politics.
Yes. Yeah. No, I thought. Well, what's interesting, I would say, is politics creates its own truth, and that was a caricature and an incorrect caricature of Justin at the time a decade ago when he got into politics.
And you think politics has made him dumber, like it does many people?
But it makes everyone dumber. I mean,
Yeah.
it made Stephen Harper dumber.
Yeah.
To the so Justin Trudeau was elected Canadian Prime Minister because he was the opposite of Stephen Harper. Stephen
Yeah.
Harper was this sort of avuncular, cranky, like Justin was, a 40-year-old who acted 30, and Harper was like a 50-year-old who acted 70. And Harper was cranky before he became prime minister, and becoming prime minister just makes you crankier. And I think in Harper's case, he had a naturally partisan, defensive disposition. I'd met Harper several times before he became prime minister, and I even put this in the National Post column, is that this guy is too antisocial to become prime minister. He's like, in our editorial meetings with him, he was just, I think he'd literally roll his eyes if he didn't like the question. Whereas Trudeau was all sort of like firm handshakes and hugs and steely-eyed eye contact and charisma.
Kind of things you expect of a politician.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he had a natural, and he was very good and physically energetic when it came to the street level politics.
I'm learning because I've come back to Canada, and I can see what looks like more of an American tinge of this left, right, and whatever is a guy. He seems to be trying to take on the mantle of the cultural warrior, at least. That I see in the States, that the right is in the States, the right is using culture wars as a hook to try and attract, and they are to attract what were some liberals, and I see him doing this somewhat of the same thing in Canada.
Yeah, so this guy, his name's Pierre Poilievre, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who leads what is called the Conservative Party in Canada, although the politics of Canada's Conservative Party are probably align more with the Democrats in the United States. It is true that he's taken on some of the postures associated with the right-wing culture war in the United States. He made some noises about the World Economic Forum, some of the, frankly, conspiracy theories about the WEF. But in general, he's sort of backed off from that stuff because that stuff really doesn't fly particularly well in mainstream Canadian politics. As with the primary system in the United States, you kind of have to go to it's centrifugal at the beginning to kind of get mobilized followers, and then it's centripetal after you've conquered that part of it, where you're trying to go back and get mainstream voters. In Canada, the media has just a very sensitive tripwire over anything that seems even remotely conservative, so you tend to get punished severely for any posture that's conservative. Also, I mean, to be fair, Poilievre also was sort of full-throated in defense of this Ottawa convoy protests, which maybe some of your listeners have heard about, which really was a kind of populist, not quite anti-vaxxer, but like anti-vaccine mandate protest that took place in Ottawa. And the politics of that were not particularly radical by U.S. conservative standards, but Canadians, I mean, they treated it as like, the invasion of Rome by the Vandals.
As an insurrection, which of course,
Prime Minister. Oh no, they thought it was like the Bolshevik takeover of St. Petersburg in 1917. Except they disapproved of it. It was a big moment, and I think that was sort of how Poilievre's image was cemented, and maybe will always be cemented in the mind of a certain kind of progressive journalist or voter, I mean, which is fair enough. Like, he did put down stakes with the convoy protest. That said, if you look at the actual substance of his position and the substance of pretty much like any conservative Canadian politician, it's, none of them want to get rid of abortion. Things like, the death penalty has been prohibited in Canada for many years, and that's
probably even when I left, I can't remember, but probably
it was a Supreme Court decision, probably about 20 years ago, not quite 20 years ago, but you've got single payer healthcare across Canada, and I
And
don't know a
and
single.
he always speaks. They all have to speak in favor of that.
And
Yeah.
so what kind of conservatism, at least in the American idiom, the
Hmm.
idea of a conservative who's fine with single payer health care, who's fine with no capital punishment, who's fine with essentially universal abortion access without any federally mandated, uh, gestation
Hmm.
limits. Again, he's a Democrat. He's a Democrat
Yeah.
who has adopted a few culture war postures
Well,
on.
his quoting of of Jordan Peterson is another thing. I guess sort of he seems to have sided with Jordan.
Jordan Peterson has become the Emmanuel Goldstein of Canadian progressive politics. And like, again, to be fair, especially in the most recent incarnation of Jordan Peterson, like, he says some pretty provocative stuff.
Oh, he does. I know.
Yeah.
Having
So
we've
it's,
been
yeah.
talked together and we email, and he says
Yeah.
things that I just find sometimes
But
patently ridiculous.
it's sort of like you now have progressives who define their demonology
Mhm.
of conservatives according to like how many times they've retweeted Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
become like the currency of progressive outrage.
yeah.
You know,
Although he says, there's a number of things. Obviously, since I've talked to him, there's a number of things I strongly agree with as well, and that his concerns have been. So
he
it's an
has an
interesting.
outsized influence on both sides, among
Yeah,
his
I'm
supporters and
amazed.
among his detractors. He's
Yeah.
become this odd sort of litmus test about where you stand on a dozen issues. It's
Well,
a
let's talk about issues now. I want to move on to your writing, and I guess I do want to, I was going to talk about the walrus, but I think I'll skip that. I want to talk about how you got involved in Quillette because that's how I know you best,
yeah.
both as an editor and a writer. And then I want to talk about some of the recent stuff you've written, including the incredibly comprehensive investigative journalism, which is, I don't know if it's the longest story that I've ever read in Quillette, but it certainly was one of the longer ones, 15,000 words, I think.
It was long.
Um, and and yeah. Anyway, it's someone who I don't know if I would say I get paid by the word in Quillette. I know I wouldn't have been allowed to write
That's
it.
why Dickens novels were so long,
Yeah,
right?
I
He
know,
used
I
to
know. Scribble,
serialize,
scribble,
yeah.
scribble. I know
Yeah,
Dickens was
not.
very.
I'm absolutely not comparing myself to Dickens. I don't
No,
want
no, I know, but it's
some troll
exactly
to
right. He got
say,
paid by the
yeah.
word. It's clear
No,
why his.
John Kay does Krauss podcast compares self to Dickens. Like, I do not want that.
No, no, but I know, I know that feeling, and I'm aware of it when in writing for
Yeah.
Word. But anyway, how did you get involved with Quillette? And I and Quillette is another interesting. People often see Quillette and boy, it's another lightning rod. Like it's suddenly I'm a right wing whatever because I write for Quillette. And and how did you get involved?
So I've always been a gadfly in journalism. So when I was at the National Post, which was and remains to some extent a conservative publication, I was sort of like the token liberal on the editorial board. And especially when it came, like, climate change was an issue that I really spoke out on. This was, say, the 2000s, maybe the very early 2010s when I was at the National Post, and there were a lot of conservatives who were like, "Oh, global warming is a myth. It's all
Yeah.
sunspots. It's natural. Anthropogenic global warming is made up. It's Al Gore convinced Kofi Annan that this was an issue. It's like." And I said, no, that's nonsense.
Yeah, the
And
scientific background for you is important.
it was. Although there are plenty of scientists who spout nonsense and plenty of non-scientists who spout truth. So
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah.
want to create a
But at
sort of
least
like.
being skeptical and worrying about evidence, which is all that really matters to me.
I mean, I was reading. I'm not a climatologist. I'm not an oceanographer. I'm not a solar scientist. But I know enough about science and engineering and math that I'm able to read peer review papers in all of these fields and at least understand what their conclusions are, what their methodology is, because again, I spent years studying science and it gives you a certain kind of vocabulary. And I remember I'd be in editorial board meetings with conservatives and say, like, are you really claiming like there's this conspiracy among, several different academic fields, which includes the editors of all these peer-reviewed journals, and chairs of department of all these different fields, because global warming is not one scientific field.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It crosses over to half a dozen different fields, all of which, you know, uh, you know, observation of Earth phenomena and thermodynamics and all these sort of things It seemed like crazy to me that says, no, the whole thing's a hoax. And so I kind of became estranged from mainstream conservatism on that basis. But I'm kind of like, to be fair, I'm sort of made my whole career becoming estranged from things, because then
It's not so bad.
no, because then I went to the Walrus, which you mentioned briefly, and the Walrus is a kind of like paradigmatic um, Canadian progressive, bien pensant, left of center, very worthy monthly magazine. A lot of stuff about feminism, that publishes poetry. A lot of like activists get published there, and the writing, just to be fair, the writing is good. It's fact checked. It's still around. It's thewalrus.ca if anybody wants to read the material. And I'm proud a lot. I became the editor in chief for a brief period in 2016, part of 2000, like maybe almost 2 years. And I mean, at the time I thought, oh, well, this is great. I've become estranged from conservatism, but now I found my place in the world. But then, in keeping with my personality, I very quickly took note of the hypocrisies and pieties that characterize left-wing journalism in Canada.
Yeah.
And the blind spots, and there was friction there too. And a lot of that was my fault, because I think to be the editor-in-chief of that kind of like establishment Toronto left-wing, a lot of the money comes from charity, and it's the same kind of funding sources as you'd get from like the opera and the symphony. You have to exhibit a certain kind of like forbearance when it comes to like a lot of the humbug surrounding Canadian leftism. And I understood that going into the job, but it wasn't in my personality to stick with that. And I left in frustration, because it wasn't just the editorial policies. It's just the job wasn't right for me in terms of my personality. And I think both my supporters and detractors would acknowledge that that's true. And for a couple of months after the Walrus, I thought, well, I guess I'll just be like this ghostwriter who, I don't know, occasionally writes on social media and maybe contributes. I started contributing to The Atlantic and the New Republic, and I just like doing freelance and paying the bills with ghostwriting. And then I started reading Quillette, and Quillette was like, wow, this is a publication that maybe even I cannot become estranged from, because I like, it just seems to be very sensible and based in science, and was like equally dismissive of left and right urban
Which
legends.
people don't realize.
Well, so what's interesting about Quillette is not a conservative publication. And we established that definitively during the pandemic, because we stood foursquare behind vaccination and the science of vaccination and the science of public health. And we actually lost writers and lost readers because, we refused to, write about the giant hoax that is the COVID pandemic. And my boss, Claire Lehman, who's based in Australia, took the lion's share of abuse, because Australia had a kind of unique relationship with COVID because it's an island, and so things went up and down there. The oscillation amplitude was much higher, and as a result, when they hit difficult patches with COVID, their public health measures were more stringent than you saw, for instance, in North America typically. So, you'd get these right-wing cultural commentators saying, oh, Australia has set up a system of concentration camps for people who are suffering from COVID. It was all BS. But because Claire did not take the bait and, refused, and rightly refused, to give oxygen to all this conspiracism, you had a lot of hardcore conservatives who followed Brett Weinstein down the rabbit hole in this issue. And there was a period, and I think the period to some extent continues now, that most of the trolls that I attract on social media, maybe not most, but at least half, are conservatives who, like, I'll tweet something about Canada Day, which we
Mm-hmm.
just observed here, and it's like, oh, are you sorry that Canada Day isn't a holiday where you throw people into concentration camps or whatnot? Like, it's just, and these are, again, these are conservatives, and
Interesting.
sometimes I have to look carefully and say, okay, well, is this a left-wing person who's upset about my views on issue X, or is it a right-wing version? And
Interesting.
because there's a rough balance between those two, I know I'm doing my job because I'm making everyone angry.
Yeah, that's well.
Yeah,
If you can do that, you've done your job.
yeah,
I just tweeted about Canada yesterday. I was intrigued to see if I'd be told because when I moved here, I was shocked. It was right at the time of all of this incredible reaction about the residential schools
right.
and where I moved into PI. I'd moved to get partly to get away from the culture wars and the first thing that happened when I was here was that the statue of John A. Macdonald was removed from
In
downtown,
Charlottetown.
and I wrote about it for the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And I was just shocked and dismayed. But I was surprised this time I didn't get any. As far as there's no
This
when
is
I
the
wrote about
first
Canada Day
Canada
yesterday.
Day since 2019 that hasn't been accompanied by a social panic. Well, social panic's too strong a word. By an obsessive focus over masks,
Hmm.
national shame about, like, how can you celebrate a genocide state,
Yeah.
or some combination of their, like, public health and national self-recrimination.
Hmm.
Like, in my neighborhood, people were actually able to, like, do fireworks and have barbecues and picnics and not get hectored about how they were failing at public health or failing at the job of reconciliation in regard to Indigenous communities. Like, it was actually just like a normal Canada Day. It
Yeah, I
actually
was
felt
shocked. It
very
was
good.
just like a normal. I was really, it was really great this year to see that. I mean,
Yeah.
not that still don't carry flags. I've never been a flag carrier.
No, I mean, that's the thing about Canada Day. It's like, I'm kind of typical. Like, when I grew up, celebrating, July 4th, 4th of July in the United States, like, I was always like this sneering Canadian is like, oh, look at those silly Americans.
Yeah,
Patriotism is the
yeah,
opiate of their masses.
yeah,
And Canadians always prided themselves on being muted in
yeah.
their love of Canada. But then the kind of overboard self-flagellation that you saw among progressives in Canada in recent years has actually, as these things often happen, history works in
Yeah.
force and counterforce, has sort of awakened this, call it American style, more full-throated, patriotic uh, spirit that you now see with, like, people going around with flags. And it's like, I kind of like it, to be honest. I mean, Canada's an amazing country. Historically, we've, like all countries, we've done some bad things, and I think progressives have a point that we need to take frank stock of it, especially in regard to Indigenous people. Although we went, like, totally overboard, there was a movement, and you still see it with, like, Canadian progressives insisting that Canada's government have to apologize for slavery,
Yeah.
even though slavery was outlawed by the British decades before Canada came into existence. But there's all these, like, esoteric arguments. It's like, yeah, but Canada was formed by people who were the
Yeah.
sons and daughters of people who profited from. It's like, okay, I get it. None of us, 6 degrees of separation from
Yeah.
sin. None of us are without sin. But, like, the desperately felt need to piggyback on American obsessions with, like, the 1619 project and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
well, this is a good segue because I was thinking of what articles of yours to focus on, and I picked three or four. But the first, and there's several articles, but the first subject that we may as well talk about is this mass grave thing because what intrigues me, I always and if it isn't clear, I try and connect science and
Yep.
other things periodically in this in the podcast because I think it's an essential part of public policy as well as culture. And by the way, I will, although it's self-serving to say this, I will say the reason I wrote my physics of climate change was specifically for conservatives because I found that conservatives would refuse to listen to the science because they didn't want to hear the policy recommendations that they
Sure.
should stop driving their cars. So I said, and it was a friend of mine who's a libertarian. Well, no, it was actually Penn Jillette, who's a magician. And he basically said, I just want to hear the science so I can make my own decision. So I decided to write a book with no policy recommendations, just on the science of climate change, hoping that it would be more receptive to conservatives who could say, okay, I've read the science, but I still don't want to do these
Yeah.
policies. So anyway, but it was interesting how that people turn their mind off or switch off if they feel that the science is going to, or that the discussion is going to require then policy recommendations that they disagree with. They'd rather not even discuss the science or think of it as a hoax. So that's why I wrote that
Segue,
particular book. And
segue. You just name dropped a magician. Is that Penn, the Las Vegas
yeah,
Penn?
Penn and Teller, yeah, they're friend, yeah, both friends of
So
Penn.
how are you with getting tickets? Because I'm going to Vegas in a couple
I
weeks.
will get you. I will get you. In fact, not just tickets. I'll get you special seats and
Okay.
backstage.
So
Okay.
I knew it was the right decision to do this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Again,
at the
yeah.
end of this, I may do a magic trick or two for you because I like magic. And so
Okay.
I probably will. In fact, I have some in my pocket right now. But
Oh boy, it's almost like this was set up. Like
yeah, with
what
almost it
what's
is.
that
And
you
I
say,
will
Lawrence?
say,
Yeah, yeah.
to my great pride, although I did very little, but if you go look for the scientist deck of cards, it was one of their magic tricks that I helped them with. But anyway,
Okay.
but Penn is an amazing man, and we've had a podcast, and a very totally self-educated, but one of the most widely read people I know. But
Yeah.
he is a libertarian, and he doesn't like to be told what to do. And he said, basically he said, this is the book I've always wanted, which is, and it was a factor for me. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic when I had a lot of time in my hands. And I said, let me just write a book showing the science. Hey, this is just the science. You can decide to do with it what you want. This is just science. There's nothing. Anyway, so that, but your arguments reminded me of that. And I kind of hope it'll have some longevity in that regard, at least be more. We actually sent it to every member of Congress, hoping that some of the conservative members of Congress who didn't see this as an advocacy book
Right.
might. And actually, one of their legislative age didn't get of a Republican legislative age actually didn't get touched with me. It didn't have the obviously impact I'd like. But now, anyway, getting back to you and not me, if it's possible. The and then we will do a magic trick, I promise.
Okay.
The let's talk about the reason I want to talk about the hot button topic of mass graves is I view this as one example. When I talk about what got me into public policy discussions, is that you should all I have this quaint notion that public policy should be based on empirical evidence, and
Yeah.
also should be testable. So if it doesn't work, you change your mind. The kind of things a scientist would do. And fact versus faith, I've kind of been a well-known supposedly atheist, and part of the reason is I think I don't like basing anything on faith, no matter what. I mean, it's okay to have a predisposition to something, but then you test it against empirical evidence. And as someone who came in to Canada right in what seemed to be the height of this amazing self-flagellation over the schools. And I should tell you, I studied Canadian history for a while before going physics, so I have so it hit me as well. But this fact that if you ask most people on the street, I think most people on the street would say that mass graves have been discovered in Canada, and yet you wrote a piece you wrote just the other day said in Canada asking for evidence now counts as denialism, which is something I see all the time in academia. Ask what's the evidence that academia is systemically racist or sexist? Just tell me the evidence. That immediately makes you sexist or racist. And here, you talk about the possibility that asking for evidence may become illegal. Oh, I doubt it. I hope it won't be. But why don't you elaborate on that?
So first, I will say, I was hesitant to choose that as a headline because for those, I wrote a whole book about conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
About a decade ago. It was called Among the Truthers, and
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's familiar with conspiracist subcultures will know that a very common trope among hard-boiled conspiracy theorists is, "Hey, I'm just asking questions. I'm just looking for evidence."
Yeah. Yeah.
Did
I've seen
planes hit
that.
the World Trade Center, and
Yeah.
did the fuel inside the planes cause the destruction, or was it controlled demolition? I'm open-minded. I just want to see evidence. And then you say, well, okay, let's let's look at the NIST report on the collapse of WTC 1 and 2. Like, how about that? It's like, Purdue University did this detailed finite element simulation of, did you look at that? It's like, yeah, but the people who wrote it are like, it's led by the second nephew of Rockefeller, and like, and then let's just ask questions about like whether they're in on it. And so the trope of I'm just asking questions has a long and not particularly salutary tradition in this field. And so just asking questions in a kind of dogmatic way where you're going toward a preconceived conclusion is not a good way to get at the truth.
You can hide it. You can clothe it in the
you can
seeming sense of science, and I see it in aliens. I get it everywhere. Climate change, aliens.
Yeah. So I think just to lay out the basis on the residential school grades thing is that for those who are outside Canada, and I presume that most of your listeners are outside Canada, although who now, maybe the white hot star power of Jonathan Kay will draw in millions of Canadians. So who knows? I doubt it. But Canada, as maybe even people outside Canada know, has this in many ways shameful history in regard to Indigenous peoples. European people came, really starting in the 17th century, and then quickly dwarfed the Indigenous population. We made treaties with Indigenous people. In many cases, those treaties were broken. All sorts of diseases were spread. As more Europeans came, the balance of power shifted against Indigenous people. The construction of the railroad across Canada meant that people just had less contact with Indigenous communities in the interior, with whom they often were, rubbed elbows with when it was difficult to get across the country. Now you could take the train and then you could fly, and many Indigenous communities kind of became forgotten. And in the 19th century, and continuing on and well into the 20th century, there was a blueprint, an educational blueprint, which was championed, I should say, by many progressives, as we would now call them, including Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien, who was a longtime Liberal Prime Minister late in the 20th century, where Indigenous peoples were going to be benefited and integrated into the Canadian economy and educational system. They were going to be taught English and French, taught valuable vocational skills. However, it also was the case that many of these schools were left to the supervision of priests, nuns, ministers, without adequate supervision. Some of them, as you can imagine, were cruel. Some of them, even if they weren't cruel, were negligent. The thousands of children who were after 1920 were in many cases forced to go to these schools. There was corporal punishment. In many cases, they were punished with sadistic punishments. In some cases, not all cases, if they spoke their Indigenous languages, they were stripped of their culture. And all of this, rightly, was made the subject of national investigation. There was Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was struck and delivered an authoritative report, which detailed all this and actually made an accounting of there was at least 3,000, and it's probably more like 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 or 7,000 children, students who enrolled in these so-called residential schools and died. Typically, as I said, of tuberculosis, but the death rate, even in an age when children, tragically many of them did die of preventable diseases, or now preventable, there was a higher proportion that died at residential schools. So all of this is fact. No one is denying it. And this is a baseline for what happened in 2021. In 2021, additional allegations were put forward based on ground penetrating radar surveys, GPR surveys that were done. At first, it was a former Indigenous reserve, or so I should say, former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. And it was said that GPR data, this ground penetrating radar data, indicated the presence of 215 child graves that had not been known before. And it was indicated that, it was suggested that these were not just children who had died of tuberculosis, but perhaps children who had been murdered in cold blood. And that what we were dealing with wasn't just the neglect and racism that had already been documented for many years in regard to residential schools and its legacy, but this was something new. And it was something like out of a horror film, where hundreds and perhaps thousands of children, because other GPR surveys were made in other parts of the country, were extinguished in cold blood. And a lot of people, including me, took this at face value. However, this was 2 years ago, and as the months passed, it began to emerge that the only evidence for this was this GPR data. Now, anybody who's listening to this and maybe is in construction or excavation or, archaeology, or in my case, I've worked in geology and stuff like that. I have some passing acquaintanceship with GPR technology, and is very limited what it can determine. What you typically have to do is you get readings through GPR. It shows you things like soil dislocations, like, well, the density of soil is greater here, and then there's you have a disruption, and then you have another patch, and then another disruption, and then you have to dig up the earth to see what's actually there. GPR survey data can show you the best place to dig to do further invasive investigations, and it is used for, among other applications, it's used to find like pipes and old irrigation ditches and tree roots, and it's also used to find old cemeteries, because typically, graves are spaced at regular intervals. And this GPR data that was announced in 2021 in Kamloops and these other reserves was said to be consistent with the presence of 215 graves that had been secretly dug and children thrown into them. But there hadn't been any follow-up investigation. And it now appears that these claims are kind of dubious, because in all that time, no human remains have been found.
Let me ask. I mean, I've gotten that out of your piece and reading, but what I don't know is, has excavation happened? Has people deliberately not wanted to disturb that sacred ground, or has people try? I mean, the natural thing to do would be to dig. It's like a forensic thing. If you're looking for a murder, usually you dig up you try and find the body.
So this is the thing. So it said, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any systematic effort to investigate it, which is odd for a few reasons, because it's been claimed, well, this is sacred ground, so we can't disrupt it. To which my response is, wait a sec, some white guy, it's alleged, took a dead child and threw it into the ground to cover up evidence of his crime, and that's sacred ground?
Yeah.
If that allegation is correct, this is the very opposite of sacred ground. This is a crime site. And by the way, that white guy who allegedly did this, he could still be walking the earth, because some of these schools operated well into the Cold War period. It's not impossible that some of these people could be alive, and to the extent we're taking it seriously, like this is an actual crime site,
punishment.
It should be. Say, well, you want to dig up old bones and re-traumatize the survivors? It's like, well, if these were claimed white students who were, if it was said that there are 215 white kids who were buried in the local provincial park, you would have yellow tape and shovels and people in hazmat suits and provincial investigators there, like within 24 hours.
Not just that. Generally, in crimes, people generally like to get closure by finding out if their relative who is missing in this case, it's kind of the opposite, where again, it's all very hazily done. It's like, well, I'll give you one example. It's a United Nations body. It's either under the auspices of the United Nations or the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Basically, people with expertise in analyzing evidence like this in places like Srebrenica or Rwanda, for instance, their services have been made available. And
the last I heard of this in early 2023 is their services were rejected on the basis, at least temporarily, on the basis that they weren't informed enough about like indigenous cultural practices, and there wouldn't be enough leadership being exerted by local indigenous tribes. The whole thing seems very kind of dodgy to me. I want to emphasize that it is absolutely not out of the question that bodies will be found at one or more of these sites.
Mm-hmm.
Canada, like pretty much every country on earth, is full of unmarked cemeteries.
Yeah.
Cemeteries that used to be marked, but in the early 20th century, it wasn't uncommon. A pauper's grave would be marked, if at all, with like a small wooden cross that would succumb to the elements after a couple of months, and then it becomes an unmarked grave. It is, this. I think Kamloops Residential School. I think there was a church, and I think there's cemeteries at many of these places, because any place you have a church, you often have a cemetery. If you tore up the ground in all of these places, I'm sure you would find a few bodies.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that these are bodies that were buried secretly in unmarked graves to begin with, and that the bodies of children, and that they're murdered children, it's like 4 different logical steps you're taking.
Yeah.
But all of that was taken on faith by the Canadian media in late May and early June of 2021, on the basis that, well, we have this GPR data, this ground penetrating radar data, and it was sort of imagined in the public mind that this like radar, you could like see little skeletons, or you could see caskets or whatnot, which GPR data shows nothing of the kind. It shows soil dislocations, which are typically used as areas to further investigate through invasive means. This was all taken at face value, in part because Canadians were assured that the idea of these children being murdered and buried in these spots accorded with the sort of mystical teachings of Indigenous knowledge keepers. And very few journalists wanted to be seen as interrogating the epistemology of Indigenous knowledge keepers. I mean, what do knowledge keepers keep? They keep knowledge. Well, if it's knowledge, then that's good enough for us.
Yeah, and then there you go. I mean, that's part of my. We can. That's another hot button issue. But I mean, I've written about this. New Zealand, of course, has gone to the extreme of trying to teach, quote, indigenous knowledge along ways of knowing alongside real science in science classes. And I've gone on record, and I'll say it every time. There's no such thing as knowledge except empirical knowledge. There's no revelation. The revelation isn't knowledge. Never has been. Never will be.
And it comes full circle to some extent into a kind of right-wing, call it right-wing Christian creationism, where things are known kind of because it is known, Khaleesi, and it's anti-scientific, but in the Canadian context, it very much became a political phenomenon, because what happens was all this, what I'm describing here, was sort of compressed into a kind of social panic that played out in the space of a couple of weeks in the late spring of 2021. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, went in very deep on it, and immediately lowered Canadian flags on public buildings, and lowered them for 5 months.
Yeah.
Which was, I mean,
I was wondering when I first moved here, which was in that time, why all the flags were lowered. I didn't
more than
quite know.
5 months, and it became this kind of mortifying spectacle, because he was asked, well, it's been 5 months, like when are the flags going back up? And he said something to the effect of, well, like when Indigenous people tell me that they can go back. But when are Indigenous people going to say, when is some duly designated representative of hundreds of thousands of people, to the extent any such person could present themselves, say, okay, it's been 3.5 months, that's exactly enough time, now they can go. So then on some, I think it was Remembrance Day, the whole thing was kind of mortifying and pretextual. The flags went back up, but from that moment, Justin Trudeau did a photo op. He went down on one knee at another First Nation, not Kamloops. And the Liberals, it was also an election year, so the Liberals campaigned hard on being kind of the penitents in chief of Canada, and there's all this important work we have to do with reconciliation and making amends, and who wants to elect those bad old racists into power, when what's really needed is people who know how to whip themselves into a good frenzy of self-recrimination, which the liberals under Trudeau in particular prove themselves quite adept at. Academics went in hard on it. This proves we need to decolonize the campus, and journalists went in hard on it, including conservative journalists. And then as the months passed, and it was kind of like, oh wait, it's been 6 months, it's been 12 months, it's been 18 months, it's been 24 months. We haven't actually found any bodies or human remains. No one really had any interest in revisiting this issue, because if you were a journalist, it often meant you then had to go back and delete about a dozen tweets and maybe correct half a dozen stories you've written about all this, treating all this as fact. Politicians, they'd all, not all of them got down on one knee, but they'd all said things that reflected a credulous attitude toward this, and no one wants to correct the record. So instead, what you had now journalists and politicians, they talk about 215 potential graves, 215 plausible graves, 215 suspected graves. Around a year ago, you started seeing these words creep into journalism, where journalists and politicians would take stock of the fact, okay, we admit it, we don't actually know the graves are there, which, by the way, hadn't been the case for the most part when the story was first reported. So they were kind of going forward, started to kind of cover off the fact that no one had actually seen any real evidence that these graves were there. But there was this sort of gentleman's agreement among Canadian pundits and politicians that we're just kind of take a mulligan on all that stuff we said in mid-2021. We're not going to revisit that because everyone went in hard on that. And if other people aren't going to admit they were too credulous, I'm not going to admit it. Because so it's sort of like kind of a herd mentality.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, it is, and we'll just agree to slowly.
But there's no other issue like that. It's completely unique. I don't know any other issue in Canadian journalism where it's just there's this kind of tacit agreement that we kind of went nuts on the story, and but the Canadian press made it the story of the year for 2021. And in their announcement of it being the story of the year, they described them as unmarked graves. Canadian reporters had not yet gone into the ass-covering habit of saying, plausible graves or potential graves. So you could go online, and these stories are still there, uncorrected. New York Times wrote at least 2 stories.
I want to end this eventually when we get there, about talking about what we can do, and journalism. The idea of not saying we're wrong, which is, I think this. My new book says, I don't know, is the key, most important 3 words in science. It should be the most important 3 words in journalism and in politics.
And parenting.
Parenting and teaching. Yeah. Absolutely. And I've always said that parents and teachers should be much more willing to say, I don't know, because it's an invitation to discover. It's not just a negative thing. It's an invitation. Let's try and figure this out. But yeah, no, I think it tends to be more the norm than the exception. I mean, I'll give another example, and I don't want to go into it a lot because I remember having Matt Ridley on the podcast, and who wrote a book about called, I think it was called Virus or something, or Viral. Anyway, it was about with the pandemic, the source. The key question did it come from a lab in China? And it's a fascinating subject where we still don't know the answer, to tell you the truth. But the press jumped right, as did many outlets, but the press and to some extent the scientific community jumped on it right away and said, no, it cannot be. It's because that's a dangerous political statement, even though, I mean, there were some right-wing people who were saying it was bioweapons and they intended it, but the whole point of this was maybe it was an accident. And no, we can't have that discussion right now because that is politically unacceptable. And then and so all the media just said there's no substance to this conspiracy theory. And of course, now we don't know, and the media is sort of you begin to see, even in the media that were totally refused to discuss it, that now are at least willing to say, especially as scientific reports come out saying we don't know. But you see that same backing off. It's not as extreme.
The same embarrassing spectacle where I remember there was a letter. I think it appeared either in Science or Nature. Signed off by multiple luminaries.
Yeah.
saying, it's no one should talk about how this could be COVID came out of a Chinese lab, and then the Biden administration itself, Democratic administration, I forget, maybe it was a year ago or 18 months ago, basically openly said, we're going to investigate whether this was from a Chinese lab.
Finally.
And I'll be honest, this has never been a big issue for me. Like, I think it's entirely possible that this was an inadvertent leak from a lab in China. I have no idea, and it's never been a strong issue for me. But I've always thought it was nuts that you weren't allowed to talk about that.
Well, what's interesting, exactly. It's nuts that you weren't allowed to talk to it, just like it's nuts that you can't ask the question, are these graves? Anytime you can't ask a question, or it's nuts, because that's the antithesis of science, but it should be the antithesis.
We have to be careful, because sometimes it is nuts. I mean, to say, was the moon landings a hoax?
Well, it's all right to ask the question. Because then I can prove why you're nuts. I can then argue and point out all the fallacies. I think that's why, Christopher Hitchens, my old friend, used to defend these Holocaust deniers, because, his point was that they should have the right to prove that they're complete idiots. No,
it's true. And Michael Shermer, who it would shock me if Michael Shermer hadn't been on this podcast.
He hasn't, as a matter of fact. But
he should be the next guest. He should be here instead of me.
No. Anyway,
he wrote a whole book that came out in 2000, I think, about Holocaust deniers. He interviewed them, and he took them. I mean, he certainly didn't take their ideas seriously. The ideas are garbage, but he took them seriously as called a pathological phenomenon in terms of the world of ideas. Like, how do you generate such garbage ideas? Because these people aren't necessarily like stupid. They're just like, there's something wrong with the way they see the world.
And sometimes they're malicious, but I guess I'm an extremist in that regard. I think there's no question that that is unaskable, no matter how ridiculous or offensive. And and we have the right to ignore it. We have the right to debate it. And all of the, how we respond to it is up to us. But right. I was very suspicious. I thought, okay, these are, because with the lab leak, and then I actually read Matt Ridley's book, which was an interesting book because it was scientific. They didn't they didn't advocate, but at the end of the book, it was pretty clear that there were a lot of open questions. And in particular, by the way, the person who organized that letter in Science was one of the people who worked with the lab in Wuhan, and so you begin to wonder about self-interest there. In any case, so I think the reason I brought this up, partly because it is a hot button issue in Canada, at least, and may raise ire of people, is, to me, it's one of these cases of, if you can't ask the question because it's so offensive to people, there's some problem. And you're absolutely right. We don't know. No one knows if these are, even if they are graves, whether they're hidden graves or, as you point out, just grave site.
To close the loop on this. The effect of all this effort to pretend that we know things that we don't actually know, culminating, and this was the subject of my article, there is now a campaign afoot among some liberal politicians and some academics to refer to anybody like you and me who takes frank stock of all these things, to label us as denialists.
Yeah,
the idea that pointing out the fact that human remains haven't been found is somehow morally tantamount to Holocaust denial, because that's the plain intention of using that word. Even
it's a continent.
It's like saying, well, you're like Ernst Zundel or something.
Well, it's become it's sort of an extension of the critical race theory stuff we're seeing in the States, where if you question it, you're suddenly automatically a racist, right? And so it's the old thing about witches, right? If you don't say you're not a witch, you're a witch, and if you say you're a witch, you're a witch.
Yes, although I will say that if we start getting into critical race theory, that the sun's gonna come down. Or
no, I'm not going to. I'm going to avoid that, because it's not even worth in our discussion. Well, maybe. Anyway, it's a different discussion. Okay, I think we've I was going to say beat that dead horse, but that's probably in poor taste. But I want to, as I say, my intent is is sort of empirical evidence and fact and reason, which I think should be one of the reasons I do this podcast, and our foundation does what we do, and much of the writing I've done in my life is that I think science and reason are not just interesting and fascinating to learn about the universe, which I think more people should be excited about, but they can be useful in the rest of our human, culture and self-governance. And so that's my deep belief and why I promote this stuff. So that's one example. There's three things I want to talk about. Just so that was one. I want to talk about another article because I just did a podcast with Hakeem Alushahi, and recorded it last week, an astrophysicist, talking about James Webb. And I noticed, you had a piece actually a long time ago, last year, December last year, on what happens there and the danger that come from trying to have frank discussions about issues where scientists have become ideologues, and a large part of the scientific community, especially in astronomy, have become ideologues, I would argue, and I've written about this, I think, in Quillette, among other places. And then I want to go to the McMaster masterpiece that you wrote, because I want to talk about academia, and then after that, I'd like to talk about what we can do, because I think a lot of this is a relationship of journalism and public policy. So in any case, I want to jump to this. I don't want to spend a long time because I just did a whole podcast, but you wrote a piece early on, one of the earliest pieces I saw, which was around the time that New York Times wrote a reporter there, Michael Powell, did a great job writing about this, but an astrophysicist happens to be president of the National Society of Black Physicists, Hakeem Alushahi, as he taught me how to pronounce his name, looked at this claim, which was a small group of ideologically based, I can't help but say it, astronomers had argued that the James Webb Space Telescope should not be named that because he was a homophobe and probably racist and anti-Semitic and whatever else, because somehow in the 1950s that was the norm. I first learned about it, to tell you the truth, I first saw a ridiculous piece in Scientific American, which unfortunately used to be a good scientific journal. I used to write for it, but it's now not. They wrote a piece saying it shouldn't be named Hubble, it shouldn't be named James Space Telescope because of that, and I automatically get my hair on my head sticking out when I see mores of this era being imposed on people in an earlier era. I thought it was just that. I didn't know the claimed evidence, but where it lost any credibility to me was when I saw their supposed solution was to rename it the Harriet Tubman Space Telescope, because Harriet Tubman in the Underground Railroad must have looked at the North Star at some point. And I thought, well, okay, this is just kind of push. It's obvious that this is being driven by something other than the science. So Hakeem was working at NASA and looked at this and came up to the conclusion there was no evidence for it. And he thought it would just end the debate, but he found exactly the opposite. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about it.
So I remember being struck by that. And I think I put it in the article that Hakeem Alushahi, is that how you pronounce it?
Alushahi.
Alushahi.
Mm-hmm.
What was remarkable about Hakeem Alushahi isn't just
anyway. I can't get it right.
Hakeem.
Both of us are probably mispronouncing it.
Yeah. Okay. Because this is painful. I got Pierre Poilievre's name kind of right, but so let's just say I'm 1 for 2 on that.
Okay.
But what he did, I'm going to assume it's a him. What he did was a stunning self-directed research project.
Yeah, amazing, remarkable.
He went after primary documents to discover the political views of James Webb, and looked at government documents, looked as how representative were his views. And just to be clear, homophobia was rife. If any person, even a progressive person from that era, were to walk among us now, their views, they'd be shocked that gay marriage existed. In the same way, we just celebrated Canada Day, and you look at the founding fathers of Canadian Confederation, I'm sure their views of Jews were like,
Yeah,
I don't know if they were out and out anti-Semites, but it would shock me to,
I'm sure they were.
they probably were, but like,
Yeah.
Life
Okay. It
goes
was
on.
just,
Like
yeah,
just Jews,
it was just the
that was the
norm.
thing. Like,
Yeah.
you have to accept that the arrow of time goes
Although I don't know
forward.
when Benjamin Disraeli was. Anyway, go on.
But yeah, there was just a lot of anti-Semitism, and there's still a lot of anti-Semitism, but there it was sort of more, you could be a polite anti-Semite. And in the same way that it was just kind of assumed that among a lot of people, homosexuality was either, call it a sin or abnormal or a perversion or a mental disease. Unfortunately, these misguided concepts were prevalent. And this guy did this really stunning and thorough, and he's a good writer too.
Yeah.
And he published it, if I remember correctly, he published it on Medium, maybe? Like,
Yeah,
he
Medium,
self-published
and a
it.
blog on Medium.
Yeah, and he said, look, there's all this controversy about James Webb. Instead of relying on slogans, I'm going to go back and look at what he actually said and did. And he found that a lot of the things, including, I think like just
The
received
quotes from
wisdom,
him, he found that quotes,
they're made
all the
up.
stuff that was attributed to James Webb was actually misattributed, and he could
Yeah.
document it was attributed to
And it was on
actual other
Wikipedia.
people. Yeah.
So it ended up on Wikipedia, like all this misinformation about Webb, which indicted and which like suggested he was, even
Yeah.
by the standards of his time, to be a bigot,
Yeah.
was literally made up. It found its way to Wikipedia, and then people started to quote Wikipedia,
Yeah.
and then Wikipedia being what it is, like, then you get citations to the
Yeah.
misinformation that was itself based on the so
Or people would, people would claim to have read Wikipedia,
Right.
would never even read it, and they became the sources. One
Yes.
astrophysicist in particular. But anyway, go on.
Well, one astrophysicist in particular happens to be a Black woman who has very much made a name for herself as being like the leading anti-racist in the field of physics, which is fine. Like, if there's
I'm
racism,
not sure if she's, anyway, go on.
There's racism everywhere in society. Like, the progressives are wrong. It's like, you'll find racism in every academic field and every
but not
field.
systemically, I would argue. Anyway,
the point is that racism is an ineradicable disease, part of the human condition. And if you look hard enough, and sometimes you don't have to look that hard, you will find it. So I'm just saying this because if this woman says, if you want to say, I'm going to be the leading light of anti-racism in physics, that's fine. That's great. Just, tell us if you find any. However, the story was complicated here because this guy who did this incredible forensic project, Hakim, he published a book, sort of a biographical book about his own experience in physics around the same time that this woman, again, who had branded herself as kind of like, the leading light of of anti-racism among Black physicists. And it turns out like there had been this sort of like political struggle or contretemps that had gone on in the Association of Black Physicists, not all of which I understood, but like there was.
Well, as far as I can tell, that's largely invented too, by the way, by the woman. I mean, as far as he wasn't quite.
But she claimed,
Hakim, he basically said he never knew about any of that stuff. It was all new to him.
She claimed like he had done this bad stuff, but she didn't provide a lot of detail.
And the difference was, by the way, he grew up in Watts and New Orleans,
right,
in a drug dealing family, and had it's amazing his education came where it was, and she grew up in sort of a more affluent.
She's at least half Jewish, right?
Yeah, half Jewish. Which she and turned out, by the way, I wasn't going to go into the details, but I read his whole book in preparation for the interview. And he was craving. There were no books where he grew up. I mean, he was poverty in its extreme sense. And he eventually, he found Roots. That was one book. But he found The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and he started to read it. And he didn't. And what he said is he'd never heard of Adolf Hitler. And at the beginning he thought, oh, this guy's a hero. And it took him a while to. And he says that in there. And then of course he gets criticized for everybody saying, how dare you be a Hitler defender. And in any case, it's kind of because he made a joke about it. I think the fact that he was so ignorant.
Written by Albert Speer, right?
Yeah.
Hitler's architect.
In any case, but as far as I can tell, So anyway, go on.
No, but so she's very privileged to say half Jewish, which to my mind makes it a half Shonda.
Yeah.
And I was just so impressed journalistically at all the research he had done. And at the end of the day, what it turns out is James Webb, far from being like the dynamo of homophobia within, you know, the McCarthy era Washington, uh, like hardly distinguished himself as a homophobe. He was a creature of his age, but to the extent you're going to acknowledge the roots of NASA and of the exploration of space in any figure in Washington, like you're going to come across people like Webb, and if
Not
the
just that, he also discovered that Webb not only but worked incredibly hard against racism in NASA, and actually worked extreme. So that's what apparently hit him first, because he assumed that Webb was a homophobe. He assumed that what he'd read was right. But then when he started to investigate Webb, he discovered that internally Webb had worked really hard against discrimination in another aspect of
right,
NASA, and said that doesn't jibe. Why would a personality who was working so much, because racism was prevalent
sure,
back then, just as much
sure.
homophobia, why would someone who'd fight that tie against that tide be so much to jump on this tide? And that's what caused his skepticism and caused him to begin to do the
But
journalistic.
this is a true empirically driven mind,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
it's great that he was on the podcast because he's quite fascinating. And for him to admit that he read The Rise and Decline of the Third Reich, and that he sounds like he's very self-aware about like
Yeah, because he
how ignorant he was of this stuff back then. But like on the other hand, how many people, ignorant or not, are willing to like Rise and Decline of the Third Reich is not an easy read.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So I mean, but guys, people like that who are autodidacts, at least in some respects,
yeah.
and are incredibly open-minded and let the evidence drive their beliefs instead of vice
Other way
versa.
around.
They're rare birds. Like it's
But you think
very
that the reason I wanted to bring this up was not just to criticize but the reason is it's endemic of what I'm trying to pick up bits of the stories you covered that reflect things that concern me about society. One was the indigenous thing, that was again the media and politics sort of taking
I
faith
cover
over fact.
social panics.
Here,
I tend to
yeah,
cover social panics.
yeah,
That's
and here is someone who finds the empirical evidence, and the scientific community should laud him. And then what you find out is you got to begin to worry about some factors of the scientific community, because instead, I mean, the whole point of science, as he and I discussed, is scientists love in principle to find out they're wrong,
yeah,
because that's
sure.
what science is all about, because it means science has progressed. You want to first of all prove your colleagues wrong when you go into work every day, and you want to often find out you're wrong, because it means, hey, there's whole new things to discover. So you'd think the scientific community, who would promulgated this what turns out to be a myth, would say, wow, this is amazing. But instead they dug in harder, which is the signature of a dogmatist and an ideologue.
Yeah.
And so one it just raises your antenna to be worried about when a fraction of the scientific community will react so strongly against it that not only do they disagree with it and refuse to accept it, which is again like we talked about climate change, or when people refuse to accept the evidence because they so strongly believe it, but then begin to attack the messenger, which is even a worse problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of this is careerism. If you're an administrator, it doesn't matter, have to be in physics or any other field. You can advance your reputation by saying, I discovered that X is racist, and I will dedicate all my efforts to eradicating X
Yeah, by
from
virtue
our
signaling. In
discourse.
fact, you don't have to say you discovered. All you have to say is that social media has discovered it, and now I will get ahead of the group
But if
by
somebody then comes and says, that's fantastic, just so you know, we checked it out and it turns out X isn't so bad. If you're that administrator, and by the way, Lawrence, I would say if you or I were in that situation, we might come to the same conclusion. Do you really want to be the person at the meeting of the university board of governors, or your weekly brunch with the university president, saying, hey, remember that long lecture I gave you about how we had to strip X's name off all the institutions at the university? Yeah, it turns out I was wrong, and let's just like put the kibosh on all that. Who wants to have that conversation?
Well, it's even worse. Yeah. Who wants to have the conversation? But it's actually, and I think people of integrity and should have that
No,
conversation.
so you're
But
so
it's
naive.
worse.
It's
It's
ridiculous.
like saying what? No, but I actually think, having seen this, that it's a calculated decision. Let me see what where's my bread buttered? What's the percentage in just in being unfair to person X versus the percentage in being in front of a social issue. Even
Especially
if
if
you
person
know,
X is
even if you,
dead.
and I see this
James
happen
Webb
in
is
universities
dead.
all the time, they knowingly are willing to throw people under their bus because there's no percentage in doing the opposite.
Also, James Webb is dead. You can't
Yeah,
libel the dead, which
yeah.
is it. That principle is as operative in the culture war as it is in
And
civil
to show how
court.
bad it was, yeah, there were journals who are now unfortunately becoming woke who basically said, when this first was promoted, without doing any research, we will not, we'll use the initials JWST
I
in
saw
our
that.
journal, but
That's
we will
ridiculous.
not allow people to say the word James Webb.
No, but
It's,
it's
yeah,
this.
it's,
But
and
this
that's
is
a
like
worry.
it's sort of like don't say Voldemort.
Yeah.
Like there's this idea that like certain cursed words like will summon the withering of crops and the barrenness of women.
Yeah.
Like it really does revert to a kind of pre-modern form of thinking that words become magic spells.
It's
That
medieval. You hit the word. It's
really
medieval. It really
it's
is medieval.
very disturbing,
And
and it comes from people who say we should follow the evidence in every aspect of our lives,
yeah,
which is true. And they abide by that when it comes to
when it's in
global
there.
warming and vaccines and stuff that I agree with.
Yeah.
But then it's like again they go back in time 400 years in their thinking when it comes
Well,
to
I don't want
civil.
to be like we're casting stone, because the point is we're all that way. We're all
Yeah,
hardwired
yeah,
to want to believe, and it's really hard. And that one of the I promote science for a variety of reasons, but it is a good training
yeah,
to discover on how to react when you're wrong. It's
yeah.
and it's and I so it happens all the time in science. It's really hard when you believe something to be true
You
to
did
accept
that.
that it isn't.
You did that in your most recent article. So, in passing, you described how there are at least two methods of determining the existence of exoplanets, and and one is based on the interruption of light, based
Yeah.
on when exoplanets travel in front of a star,
Hmm.
and the other is based on the perturbations, orbital perturbations that take place due
Mm-hmm.
in the star itself due to the movement, the deflections based on
Yeah.
the minute gravitational effect of the planet. And you, I forget which of those two methods, you admitted, said plainly, said, I didn't think this method would work.
Oh
And it
yeah,
did work.
yeah,
And it did
yeah.
work. So I
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
No, in fact,
Yeah.
I didn't believe either method would work. So there you go.
Oh, okay. Wow. So what am I
I mean,
doing on this podcast here?
no, that's why, I got why are these people, I admire people who are willing to spend 20 years of their life on a fruitless effort. That's what experimentalists often do. But I said, well, it's just not going to, I can't see how you could measure a star moving at roughly, I mean, if you really wanted to detect Earth-like planets around our sun, you'd have to look at the motion of the sun at a speed that's not much faster than you walk.
Well,
and
you
and
made
and and,
the,
and,
yeah.
and it's amazing that people could do that, and I was shocked. And I never cease to be in awe of the ability of experimentalists to exceed my wildest expectations about what's possible. And yeah, and I love, but I love it. I mean, right? I mean, because then it means you can do things you didn't think you could do before. And anyway, it worries me, and it's a worrisome about science. And then the last thing I wanna cover was your I think a masterpiece of investigative reporting about this McMaster imaginary sex ring. One of the earliest. You may not know her, and her name was on the tip of my tongue a second ago. Elizabeth. Oh my God, I was just
Elizabeth
about to.
Weiss?
No, 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 not Elizabeth Weiss, who's an anthropologist too. I
Yeah.
know. Oh my God, I was just going to tell you, and now we're gone. But an amazing psychologist who's been. It reminded me she was instrumental in these. You may remember these court cases of people beginning to be by therapists
Yeah,
beginning to have recovered memories. Elizabeth
Loftus.
Loftus. Elizabeth
Loftus.
Loftus.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
Elizabeth
Loftus
is a hero of mine, and always has been, and she was one of our earliest
and
podcasters.
Elizabeth Loftus plays. I'm not sure if I name checked her in my article, but she indirectly played an important role, which we can discuss in the McMaster story.
Well, that'd be great because yeah, let's talk about that because it reminded me of that of this of therapists giving these imagined memories and this whole there were people who were tried and the people who lost their whole here's their kids and it was
Oh,
all
families were broken
imagined.
up. Yeah,
Yeah, it
and
was just an
I
incredible.
know from personal anecdotal knowledge a family that was broken up by an unsubstantiated, quote unquote, recovered memory of sexual abuse that was weaponized, and two completely innocent parents became estranged from a
Yeah,
child,
and
and
that's
and
why.
then and then the rest of the family had to essentially choose sides about who to believe, because you can't, it's a sort of thing you can't say, well,
Yeah,
maybe there's truth. Like, if you're saying, oh, you sexually abused your 5-year-old, you either believe it or you don't.
yeah.
And it destroyed the whole family. It
Yeah,
destroyed
yeah,
the whole
no, and Elizabeth, that's why she is a hero because
Yeah.
a lot of people have done significant academic work, and I know people. I mean, I like to think I have, but it hasn't, as I like to say, it has had no
No, she's a great scholar.
impact whatsoever on the
Yeah.
on building better toasters or
And
cars.
people tried to cancel her too.
Yeah, yeah, and so she actually her work and by appearing in these court cases, yeah, she got vilified because by the way, she did agree to be listen to the O.J. Simpson.
You know,
Her attitude was, oh, let me just see what this is, and yeah, you get vilified if you're on the wrong side. But she's a hero, and I'm happy to mention her name many times. But the McMaster, your story here reminded me of that a lot, and so why don't you give us a brief
sure.
précis of
So,
what the story's about.
as you said, it's a 13,000 word story. Although I did subsequently on Quillette publish a 2,000 word piece that summarized the story
Yeah,
and
in
gave some
fact, it's
concept.
a nice summary. I looked at that.
And maybe not everybody's going to read 13,000 words, but if you Google McMaster and Quillette, you'll find both stories. But McMaster University is a prestigious research university in Hamilton, Ontario, which is about an hour and change west of Toronto. And the psychology department is quite well known there. It's technically referred to as P&B, which is psychology, neuroscience, and behavior. And it was rocked by scandal in 2020 when it was alleged that a professor there, his name was Scott Water, was sexually abusing graduate students, female graduate students. And then subsequently, it was alleged that there was a whole sex ring. The allegation was that this included his wife, and included, even more oddly, the long-term girlfriend of the main complainant. So the allegation was that there was a whole conspiracy of people, both the main complainant and the main complainant's girlfriend were grad students in the psychology department. So all of the main players here are either grad students or professors. And then there were these other, as it turned out, completely innocent professors who were dragged in, and posters were put up in certain parts of the campus, like, if you see this professor, if you see this woman, call security. The suggestion being that these were dangerous sex criminals. Everyone was suspended. These ominous warnings were sent out to the whole university community. We have received unsettling reports of blah, blah, blah. It turned out all of the sex ring stuff was just absolutely complete fabricated nonsense. It's absolutely true that one of the professors, Scott Water, was having a consensual, I don't even want to call it an affair because that term isn't used. It's not even clear they had sex, but there was a sexual component to their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I should say, a very unwholesome type of thing, and he was subsequently disciplined by the university, but not on the basis that it was any kind of sex ring, but on the basis that he had used his authority as a professor to purport to give mental health advice to this grad student who herself was in the throes of depression and had a lot of other issues. She was cutting herself, and he had this kind of sexual relationship with her and was sort of, as I said, purporting to give her mental health advice. The whole thing was very unseemly, but it had nothing to do with any kind of like sex ring. That all of that was a social panic. But it was a social panic that destroyed the reputations of about a half dozen scholars. They were thrown off campus. Their offices were ransacked. They were completely shamed in front of their peers, and the department itself fell into chaos because all of the scholars represented a substantial fraction of the P&B department, and so there were just dozens of people whose their thesis work had to be reassigned. It affected, the knock-on effects affected probably more than 100 people. And what was interesting was a lot of these social panics get debunked. I should say there was a second main accuser who impressed me greatly, because the second accuser basically supported a lot of the things that the first accuser, who turned out to be a fabulist, had said. But this second accuser later admitted that she had been in the throes of a psychiatric episode and that she was in crisis and very suggestible. She had just watched Netflix's documentary on Jeffrey Epstein and imagined that like a lot of this had happened at McMaster. But as awful as that sounds, to her great credit, she stepped forward. I mean, not publicly, but stepped forward to those who were investigating it and said, I'm really sorry and I'm ashamed, but this didn't happen. Which is, we're talking about admitting you're wrong. I mean, imagine the stakes in admitting that. I mean, that's just a huge thing. I was very impressed. But it also says something that university officials didn't detect the fact that this was a person in crisis, and used her testimony and say, oh, look, we have a second source on this. And it was on that basis, in fact, just days after this woman formalized her complaint to the university, that many of these people were suspended. So that was an incredible thing. And one thing that I say in the article is that it had a sort of unusual ending, because a lot of the time you hear about these social panics and there's no consequences.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting about this is that the P&B department at McMaster fought back, and not just the people who had been shamed and wrongly accused. In fact, they were under instruction, as is often the case, that they couldn't say anything. Yeah. It's sort of like the Title IX investigations in the United States. I mean, we don't have Title IX in Canada, but it was something similar where they weren't allowed to say anything. They weren't even allowed to contact their colleagues. They weren't allowed to continue their academic research. In one case, a woman, the wife of Scott Water, who was a completely innocent woman, her name dragged through the mud for a year. She was told by the university administration she couldn't complete an academic project with her dying father, who was also a psychologist. On the other side of the world. He lived in Australia, and he ended up passing away. The whole thing was absolutely nuts. However, because it was so nuts, the P&B department as a whole fought back. And again, not just those who were attacked. And in part, this was because a man who was at the time the chair of the department, his name is Bruce McMillan, if I'm getting the name right, is an expert on, among other things, memory. And I got a whole trove of documents, internal correspondence involving all of this, which just made the documents made my jaw drop. And some of them I didn't even reproduce, because it was just by reproducing them, I would have outed some of my sources and some completely innocent people. But in some of his correspondence, Bruce McMillan, again, the chair of the P&B department, in warning the university in mid-2020, you are embarking on something really dangerous and misguided here, appended 4 attachments which consisted of peer-reviewed academic studies of recovered memory syndrome, including, I think they were articles by Elizabeth Loftus. And he said, it was a 2-page letter, if I remember, in not so many words, you should learn from history here, because both of the main complainants were offering what were claimed to be recovered memory. because the primary complainant had come forward in early 2020 and said, "Oh, I was sexually abused by Scott Water," and then months later came back and said, "Oh, I have all these recovered memories. It turns out there was a whole sex ring involved." And I think a layperson could ask themselves whether it's plausible that those recovered memories would assert themselves in that way, especially in a way that, as sort of mirrors a lot of the stuff from Jeffrey Epstein stuff that was then in the news. And I said in the article, if this had been the geology department or the botany department, I don't know if McMaster has a botany department. I don't know if anyone has a botany department. But it seems like an antique word. But, or the mathematics department, I think the university administration would not have been called out for their complete mismanagement of this. But because it was psychologists, because it was people who study human behavior and the fallibility of memory, they came forward, and I have recordings of them confronting university officials. This is over Zoom because a lot of this played out in the first months of the pandemic, basically saying, how are you presuming to lecture us about things like sexual trauma, things like when people are being honest and when they're lying, about memories, about witness recollections. Like, a lot of these people have studied these things for decades. And the university president, who's a chemist by the name of David Farrar, inorganic chemist, I think he deals with metallic compounds or something like that. He started spouting all this mumbo jumbo about like trauma-informed discourse. I mean, it's just like this complete claptrap that had clearly been provided for him as a sort of a set of lines to be read out by
his DEI people.
I mean, the whole thing was mortifying, but it wouldn't have ended up on my desk, and it wouldn't have ended up in my article had it not been for the fact that these were, world-class scholars in the field of psychology who felt, and also the fact that there were women involved. It's one thing to say this guy Scott Water did all this stuff. We have seen examples of this. If someone 10 years ago came and said, "Oh, there's this guy named Harvey Weinstein. He did all this horrible stuff and no one's been talking about it for 20 years." You'd be skeptical. Really? No one's been talking about it? He did all this stuff to all this women? Sure. Like, sure, pal. Like, that's BS. But it was true. And I acknowledge that in the article. So there's all sorts of examples of stuff like this being hushed up. Even as I was publishing the article, there was an example out of the UK press of an esteemed columnist who, it turns out, for years has been sexually harassing people. And there were efforts to turf him out. He was alcoholic by his own admission. But those efforts have been stymied. But that was one guy. In the case of McMaster, it was alleged there was an entire sex ring that included at least 2 female members. And I think, sort of the equivalent of Ghislaine Maxwell types based on the, Jeffrey Epstein precedent. And I think people were like, wait a second, this is kind of like Hollywood movie stuff. And it made people skeptical. So I think it was the sheer scope of the false allegations.
Okay. Okay, but let me point out, I mean, this is a fascinating story, but I didn't bring it up because it's salacious, although it is. And it's people are always interested in salacious news, and this is a clear example. What I wanted to do actually was based on your second article, which I think is more, I think what's more important is what do we learn from this?
Because the first one was the reporting, my 13,000 words of the reporting. But then, as you say, the second article was based on, like, what are the policy results?
Yeah, my reason for bringing up all of these things is ultimately to lead us to the question of how can we, what can we do as journalists, as scientists, as members of the public to try and ensure that these ideological abuses or dogmatic abuses or psychologically sick abuses, are dealt with correctly. And so, in your second piece, the lessons, which is entitled, I think, "The Lessons from an Academic Social Panic," I found particularly worth talking about. And it's those lessons because I will say, you're probably even less susceptible to being suspicious of university the university bureaucracy that is, in my opinion, like a cancer has taken over universities in terms of forbidding, in terms of requiring obeyance to ideas that may or may not be relevant, right? And totally without control of the. I mean, universities. I happen to think universities should be run by academics, and
Yeah.
and um, and in this case, bureaucracies are now run by people who are not academics, who are not part of the mission of the university, but are controlling what's happening there. And that's a, my view, and it may be extreme, but I see it more and more. And in this thing you talk about exactly how some of the fact that this panic could be could take on such an official role, first of all, and secondly, such a role which was harmful to the people involved, are things we should look at. And you talk about ways to try and ensure that might not happen again. So I wanted to walk you through some of that.
Sure. Well, one of the um, one of the conclusions that I came to was that there has to be some way for university officials, and I realize the standards differ from university to university, but there has to be some way for university officials to dismiss complaints on a summary basis that just don't make sense or are crazy, that doesn't rely on a 1-year process involving an external investigator. Because at the center of this controversy was the fact that you had women who came forward to something called the SVPRO, which is Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office, which essentially was run by one person at this time. And this one person was in charge of educating members of the university community about sexual abuse. If you thought you'd been sexually abused at the university, you came forward to this person. This person would then coach you in how to do a proper complaint.
It's not unusual. It's the norm, by the way.
This person was then the intake official for the complaint.
The, the judge is also the prosecutor. It's also, yeah.
This person would then decide if your complaint met intake requirements, and then this person would also serve on a mandatory basis based on university protocols, which were then in place, on something called the response team, which would judge, for instance, so-called interim measures, including interim suspensions. So you had one person who naturally, not to cast aspersions on who this one person was, this person became very highly vested in the narratives of the people she was helping. And, to be fair, people do get sexually abused. And, McMaster University's tens of thousands of members of the university community, it would be unusual if a community that large didn't have legitimate instances of sexual abuse. When people come forward, they deserve to be treated with respect. And it is not unpredictable that this person would become vested in what she regards as the truth of these complaints that come forward, and then respond accordingly when she's wearing a different hat and she has to judge, what interim measures are imposed and stuff like this. I talk about how there absolutely has to be checks and balances in the same way. Like, obviously, we're not dealing with protocols of real criminal justice and all the constitutional safeguards that attach there too. But even in the administrative campus setting, you can't just have one person be judge and jury. Like, it absolutely makes no sense. The other thing is, as I wrote, there has to be some way to dismiss completely complaints that are just untethered from reality. One thing that emerged from my research is that the reason that even when it was clear that these sex ring accusations made no sense, the university didn't seem to have any formal protocols that allowed its officials to say, this is crazy. Like, case dismissed.
Once
you reach the nominal theoretical intake requirements for a sexual violence complaint, you have to call in an external investigator with all that could take a year. And meanwhile, you're thrown off campus. And I put the question to university officials. They answered some of my questions, as I detailed in the articles, but not all of them. I said, this was a case where you had 5 or 6 academics who were accused of being in a sex ring, and they got, and 5 of them got suspended from the university. And your response is, well, we take this trauma-informed approach, and trauma can mess with your brain. So you could say, well, the person had 2 heads. But that could be the result of trauma. That's why they got the facts mixed up. And we're going to as long as you are accusing somebody of sexual violence and you meet that basic nominal intake threshold for the complaint, we're gonna unroll all of this machinery of justice, including apparently hiring an external investigator. And I put the question to them and says, well, in this
And
case,
I think it's unfair to call it machinery of justice, but in any case, go on. We're going to unroll this bureaucratic machinery.
It lies somewhere between machinery of justice and inquisition. Let's say there's some continuum.
Yeah.
But even let's say, but this investigator, by the way, was highly competent. I
Sure.
mean, that's one thing I acknowledged in the article. It was a woman named Catherine Montpetit, who, at least in regard to the individual cases, she was ruthless in getting after the facts. And at least one complainant, this woman who was used to everybody at the university treating what she was saying as gospel, suddenly Montpetit was having none of it, and she actually withdrew from the process because she was like, wait a sec, this was satisfying when people believed my story, but now they're asking me hard questions. But I put the questions to the university: what if instead of 5 people, what if 50 people had been accused? What if the university president had been accused? What if the woman running the SVPRO herself had been accused of sexual abuse? Would she have been suspended? Would the university president have been suspended? Would the board of governors have been suspended? Because that kind of would have made as much sense as a lot of the elements in the science fiction Epstein-like narrative that we're seeing. They wouldn't answer those questions. They just kept repeating mantras about how, we're trauma informed. And again, there's a grain of truth to all this. Is it true that people sometimes garble their recollections of actual events based on suffering trauma? Of course it's true. There's famous examples of Holocaust survivors who say wrong things. They say, there was a factory that made soap out of our bones and stuff like this. This famous case, this is 30, 40 years ago. I think it was on Donahue, of all things. And no one is saying, well, this survivor got the fact wrong, so therefore the Holocaust didn't happen. You'd have, only anti-Semitic lunatics are saying things like that. However, to extrapolate from that and say, well, we want to be trauma informed, so we're going to strip ourselves of the ability to dismiss on a summary basis even the most far-fetched claims, means you're going to get a lot of false positives. And at some point you have to be able to do that, or you're just going to ruin lives.
Well, and let me come back. I mean, I think you've made an extremely important point, and I think I will come back at you and say, I think as long as these other offices do not report to ultimately an academic administration, but run independently, then the academic administration will feel like they'll be terrified of responding and saying this case should be just dismissed and so it's this independent bureau infrastructure that's occurring, obviously in McMaster, but I've seen it happen in many other institutions where literally they're not answerable, and it would be the same to say, hold on, this doesn't pass muster, as it would be to say that the indigenous graves might not be
true.
It's almost exactly the same. It'd be viewed as saying you're enabling rather than helping.
To be fair, because I realize that the organizational architecture is different at all universities, and at some universities, the DEI department operates as a kind of power unto itself. However, at McMaster, the architecture has changed somewhat, but the SVPRO, which was then part of something called the EIO, answered to the provost, VP academic, who then is a woman named Susan Tighe, Tighe. And so it was, at least if you look at the org chart, within the power of the provost to ask hard questions about all this. I don't think it would have been in Susan Tighe's remit to simply walk in and say, well, dismiss this case, that case, and the other case. But
it's often in org charts, but
morally speaking, it's a different. Yeah, it's
and I have to say, by the way, one has to give credit to McMaster, because I've also seen most universities don't even hire an external investigator. It's right. The investigation is also done by the person who takes the original data or somewhere other thing, and right. I've seen it over and over happen.
So yeah,
where there's
one thing McMaster, or at least this investigator got right, The other thing that I say is that to some extent, this is a case of university administrators being over-resourced, because at every important decision point where leadership was required, and you had Susan Tai, provost, David Farrar as university president, they didn't want to make a decision, so they hired a law. I think that I cataloged as like 3 or 4 different law firms that were brought in to investigate, or to facilitate a listening session, or to advise on best practices. They brought in a communications firm when they screwed up the original messaging, and it essentially leaked the names of all the people they had suspended, despite the fact that they didn't actually say their names, but instead they just leaked all this information that allowed everybody, including student journalists, to figure out who had been suspended. Millions of dollars have been paid out to various third parties. They had a guy from Baker McKenzie, sort of gold-plated Bay Street law firm, multinational law firm, who was on speed dial whenever they needed. His name was George Avram, memory serves. As their fixer essentially during this entire crisis. Millions and millions of dollars in legal costs, and whenever they were presented with any kind of opportunity to nip this thing in the bud, it was just like, let's kick the ball down the field for another 6 months or 12 months and have another investigation and bring in a consultant.
But you can understand, I mean, I think the point is, we need to understand that that's a natural response. Why would you want to nip, if you nip in the bud, suddenly you're seen on social media as protecting potential permit. It's so much easier to pass the buck, or to just even more aggressively get in front and say, we're going to devote all the resources of this institution to make sure that, because it plays well to the public, it plays well to the media, it plays well social media, and to students and families. And so the question, and to come down to these issues of what can we do to, it's a generic case of how can we encourage a system that doesn't encourage people to do the easy or popular, especially media popular thing, whether it's vaccines or from China or indigenous or in this case, it's a deep problem and that's the reason I'm bringing it up.
It's a huge problem in terms of system incentives, because when the university did essentially, they didn't say as much, but effectively these suspended academics, all but one of them, all but Scott Water himself, who, as I said, was censured and is still fighting to keep his job through internal tribunal mechanisms. All of them were effectively exonerated and brought back to work. When the university, through gritted teeth, I should say, announced as much, and actually gave what I think was a deceptive school-wide announcement, which it's like they couldn't bring themselves to
say they were wrong.
Yeah, it was pathetic, and one of the main bones of contention that remains among the grievers within PNB. They were at least able to say, hey, this wasn't our decision. This was this independent investigator named Catherine Maupetit, although I don't think they used her name. And they were able to strip themselves of any moral agency and say, hey, you got complaints, there's this investigator. And this is part of a theme where, if you look on the McMaster website, they make this like big song and dance of like our leadership team, our leaders who provide leadership in things like in leaderology. Like they can't shut up about how they're these great grandees who preside over the campus with their wonderful leadership. But then when you actually look at a case study like this, the absolute last thing any single one of them wants to do is attach their name to exactly the kind of decision that any real leader would do and say, what, our university is being, our entire department is being destroyed by these batshit accusations about a sex ring that everyone here knows is crazy, but no one in this room will say so. And so we're going to let a half dozen people have their reputations get trashed, and we're going to spend $10 million and let an entire department suffer for reasons that we know are BS. I'm a leader. This ends now. That's what leadership looks like.
if
But no one's
well,
going to
now
say
you've
that.
hit a nail on the head. I mean, again, it's been a theme for me, but it requires leadership and integrity, and we're not seeing it in almost every area of from government. Which, well, we're used to governments perhaps not having leadership or integrity,
But it's a
but in
cliche to
academia,
say,
in
yeah.
scientific. I mean, for example, I'll give you an example, which I may have talked about in Quillette, but we see scientific leaders, the former Francis Collins, who was someone I've known for a long time, and I guess I consider a friend in some ways. Um, when he was head of the National Institutes of Health, said, "We are the field, biomedical research. NIH is systemically racist and has always been that way." Now, the point is, if he really believed that, he should have resigned, right?
Sure.
I mean,
They never
it's
do.
it's just
They
lip
never
service.
do.
No,
They
because
never do.
because he doesn't really believe it. It's not leadership. It's not saying, hold on, let's look and see. Let's do a study. Let's try and take this carefully. No, we understand that the tide of public opinion is that academia is racist, or academia is this, or science is this, is systemically racist, because that's now the thing of the moment, and I'll get out in front of it. So leaders, and you can understand, because so much of government support, public support, donor support depends upon the public perception rather than reality. So one of the things I guess I want to hit to you as a journalist, I don't want to put all of the blame on journalists, but in some sense, the question is, how can we how can journalism, how can media assist leaders and other people to have integrity and backbone, instead of jumping on every salacious story and then never writing up a story about it when it's wrong later on, be it the New York Times, or I've seen it so many examples, because it's so much easier to get clicks if you jump on the obviously salacious aspect of whatever it is, and then never is it in your interest to then step back and say we're wrong, or it just, let's move on to the next thing. So is there a solution in an area where journalists where journalism is so under attack financially that every journalistic group in some sense is vying to get attention, instead of saying we're gonna just, it doesn't sound as nice, but we're gonna try and be rational and reasonable?
Well, look, this is not a new problem. The old expression, I forget whether it was attributed to Winston Churchill or Mark Twain, who they get attributed, every famous expression. A lie travels around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes, or words to that effect. Yeah. Someone made this complaint, generations ago, and it's still somewhat the case. I like to think my own journalism provides some antidote to that, but to some extent, the problem in journalism might be getting worse. In Canada, at least, and maybe this is the case in the United States, there is a strong symbiotic relationship between university administrators and especially local media.
Yeah.
So, McMaster is a world-class university. As a world-class university, they might recruit famous scientists or whatnot. And if you're covering the academic beat for like the Hamilton Spectator newspaper, or, the St. Catharines Standard, or, or the Toronto Star, like, a lot of your bread and butter stories are going to be like interviews or profiles on famous academics, or like, discoveries that are made in the universities, or, there's some scandal that takes place at the university and you want the comms official to return your call. And it's the case that journalism is hemorrhaging jobs. And let's face it, a lot of the good jobs you can get as an ex-journalist are like assistant communications department, assistant communications manager at a place like McMaster. McMaster runs its own in-house publication. Sure. I think it's called,
they all do,
the Daily News or something. And sometimes when I look at the org charts, there's like 15 people who run the communications department, which is like more than some Canadian magazines.
Major newspapers. Yeah.
And a lot of these people,
it's because there's a lot of money involved. It's money, right? You're trying.
And it's not corruption. I don't want to say it's like,
no, it's not corruption. It's just
you want the truth.
You want to get donors. The point is, universities are relying on government funding
Yeah.
and external donors, and they have to therefore play to that audience.
But
But
ask
the
yourself,
same is true. But I would also say, again, as someone who looks at journalism, that same connection that you're talking about, yeah, journalists have to be pals in some sense with the university that they're covering. Same thing has been true in politics for the longest while as well. You have to have
politics
sources.
is oppositional. So politics, at least in the
Well,
United States, you have, if you're at the Daily Caller, or if you're at, I don't know, the Daily Beast or
yeah,
whatever, like, there's a natural oppositional thing where you've got people from both sides leaking
well,
stuff.
maybe,
With
except you see
academia,
that, if on the other hand, if you want to have sources, you can see that the pressure on institutions, well, I mean, in case, say, of Fox News or whatever, you want to have access to the highest levels. In some sense, you have to play ball.
university. So going back to McMaster,
Yeah.
because this is actually something I mentioned in the story. The local newspaper is the Hamilton Spectator, and the Hamilton Spectator covered this a ton when it was still thought that all these allegations were real. So at one
Mhm.
point, I detailed, there was a reporter there. She's no longer there anymore. Her name's Catherine Clark. She did a 5,400 word story detailing in every salacious, credulous, molecular level detail of the accusation what the first complainant against Scott Water, her name, the court called her SL,
Yeah.
like, every single detail is written. 5,400 is a huge story
That's a huge story for a
for a
newspaper.
newspaper. And so, there were numerous other stories about, the horrors inflicted on the school community by Scott Water. But then Scott Water was cleared of criminal wrongdoing in 2022 in open court, and then university, on top of that, university investigator had determined that none of the sex ring stuff was true. And guess what? The Hamilton Spectator lost interest in the story real quick.
Because there's a lot of, yeah, it's,
But
as
this isn't a conspiracy. But imagine
it's
yourself, you're Catherine Clark or any of the reporters, and if you write this tell-all about the horrors allegedly inflicted on this poor woman by this Jeffrey Epstein-like sex criminal, you can win awards in Canadian
yeah,
journalism on
yeah,
that
and you
basis.
don't get awards for saying this is wrong.
I'm an Australian, so I'm based in Toronto, but what does it tell you that this is 3 years after the McMaster, this imaginary sex scandal unfolded at McMaster University, that the outlet that ended up finally writing about, because the people involved in this were shopping the story around
Yeah,
to
yeah,
Canadian outlets. I
yeah,
have to imagine. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but it'd be shocking that they weren't trying to interest. Because I had so many sources on this story. It's just clear that people at McMaster were waiting for 3 years for someone to write the definitive story on this. The fact that they had to come to an Australian outlet, albeit, I'm a Canadian journalist, think about that they couldn't get anyone at the Toronto Star interested. They couldn't get anyone at the Hamilton Spectator interested. They couldn't get anyone interested. Local radio, CBC, my God, like this, CBC would treat this story as radioactive. It's the opposite of believe the victim. This is not something I got into because I don't want, I didn't want the focus of the story to be
but it's
impugning.
what I want to get into. It's the
It's a
problem that
real
we have.
issue. It's
Yeah,
a real
and
issue.
there's obviously no easy solution, but I want to raise it because I think the only way to change these things is get the public more aware of the situation, and that's why I think, that's why part of the reason why we do this is we're trying to get people aware of wonderful things about the world and other things that people should be
But this
concerned with.
brings us back full circle to your introduction, because,
Yeah,
and by the way, we've been doing this for 3 hours, so I think
yeah,
I'm going to collapse. But I
we're
want to
gonna,
bring it like, the classic shape in antiquity was always
yeah,
the circle, and I want to bring this
yeah,
back.
that's what I was trying to do just now too.
So the full circle. When you introduced me, you said en passant, you said, "Oh, you write for Quillette, and you write for Quillette, and like Quillette is considered like a bête noire among many people. It's like they call it conservative, even though it's not conservative." The reason Quillette is so controversial in certain circles is that we're not particularly conservative, but we do tell the truth about stories like this. And the story that I wrote about McMaster would be so much easier to dismiss, because I know it's been making the
Yeah,
rounds. McMaster, I get emails from people at
yeah,
McMaster thanking me for writing the story.
yeah.
If this story had appeared in like the Canadian equivalent of the Daily Caller or the Canadian equivalent of like Breitbart,
Yeah,
people would just say, it's this conservative culture war
yeah.
trash. but because like Quillette is absolutely not an anti-vaxxer publication,
Mm.
and like, half my writers are LGBT, and we're read mostly by liberals and academics and people in tech. Like, we're not a particularly
Yeah.
conservative publication. Quillette is regarded as all the more dangerous because we cannot be dismissed as serving a political agenda.
Yeah.
Like, we don't write about politics typically. Like, we talked before about Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah.
It feels like a day ago, but it was probably a couple hours ago. I don't write articles about how great Pierre Poilievre is. I don't write articles about how terrible Trudeau is. We don't really deal with partisan politics. We deal with trends in science and academia.
And that's why, that's why I've personally been attracted to writing. And it always amazes me that when I'm now, people call, right-wing conservative pundit because I write for Quillette every now and then. It always amuses me, or for the Wall Street Journal for that matter. But it saddens me at the same time. I mean, I enjoy my interactions with both you and Claire, and I really like being able to write about virtually anything that I think is on this line of promoting science, reason, etc. And I think all of the stuff I try and write in one way or another is that way, whether it's pure science or not. But it saddens me that I used to write all the time for the New York Times, but it's harder to get. It's just you can't. It saddens me that things have become so politicized that those stories that don't appear anymore in the.
Let me show you about the New York Times. It just so happens that I was looking. So as we're having this conversation, the New York Times has been going full court press on how evil the U.S. Supreme Court is because they struck down affirmative action, right?
Yeah.
This was at Harvard and UNC.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know if you can see it, but this is actual survey data.
Yeah.
That was published today. It turns out 69% of American survey respondents, including 58% of Democratic survey respondents, agreed with the proposition race-conscious admissions at Harvard, a private school, and the University of North Carolina, a public school, were unlawful. 69% of all respondents agreed with the court, including 58% of Democrats. And I was reading this. I'm a 7-day-a-week New York Times subscriber. I like the New York Times despite the politics.
Me too.
And I was like, wait a sec. So you just ran like 175 op-ed pieces about how the Supreme Court had been taken over by these right-wing wingnuts who, were setting us back to, the days before the U.S. Civil War. And now you're telling me, like, who are the real extremists here? The 68%, 69% of people who disagree with you, or the 31% of people who agree with you. And so it doesn't surprise me that your op-eds aren't being published in the New York Times.
Well, I know, and it saddens me because I think that's the way I want to end. Coming back to this at the beginning, that's data, and that should be the basis of it. Journalism, politics, our society, and generally, if we tried to base our decision making ultimately on evidence, and so that it sounds trite to say that, but that's ultimately that's the solution. But how we can get there is a long haul, and I think we need to all be aware, and not just pointing fingers at others, but ourselves as well. And that's what Richard Feynman said: the easiest person to fool is yourself. And so you have to try and prove equally hard, if you're a scientist, that your theory is wrong as well as right. And it wouldn't it be great if all of us did that more generally? And
although I'm kind of mildly shocked that Richard Feynman hasn't been canceled yet. I mean,
well, give it time.
Okay,
give it time, right. and in some places he has been. I can give you some examples, but we won't go there. I think we've hit enough hot button topics. Look, thanks for doing this. And I think that the moral, we talked about a lot of interesting subjects, but the idea of trying to get that I think is flows through all of our discussion, including your training as an engineer, is that it's really important for all of us, journalists, academics, everyone, to question ourselves, be willing to say we're wrong, and be open about it, and base our decisions on evidence, and be willing to change our mind when the evidence shows us we're wrong. And wouldn't it be a great world if we had that way? And let's hope we can be in a better world. And it's a better world for you having agreed to take 3 hours of your life to talk to me on this subject, and I really appreciate it.
Well, my theory was that it would be time well spent, and this N=1 experiment has confirmed that I was correct.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.